Good day, everybody. Welcome to the Commonwealth Civil Society Policy Forum 2021. The world engulfed with COVID-19 pandemic has made it necessary for us to meet for the second time in 2 years in the virtual platform than in the usual face-to-face meetings that we've been having in Geneva on the eve of the Commonwealth Health Ministers meeting. But the virtual platform has also brought all of us together and made it possible for lots of people to come and engage us in the Commonwealth Civil Society Policy Forum. As we face the many challenges of the pandemic, equitable and appropriate access to quality medicines and vaccines in the Commonwealth and beyond has become a hot topic. So today, it is appropriate and apt that we, as the Commonwealth Civil Society and our friends and partners from across the globe, are meeting in our Civil Society Forum to talk about equitable and appropriate access to quality medicines and vaccines in the Commonwealth, and also to look at innovative approaches and lessons that we have learned from COVID-19 that would inform us to make it happen. I'm particularly pleased today that we have with us the Right Honourable Baroness Patricia Scotland, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. Baroness Scotland, you've been with us every year since you took over as the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and you've been a tower of strength to all of us and our activities. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, and I'm sure all of us in the forum today are looking forward to your keynote remarks that we will hear in a little while. I would also like to welcome the Director General of the Commonwealth Foundation, Dr. Anne Gallagher. Dr. Gallagher has been supporting the Commonwealth civil society organizations since she took over office a little over a year ago. She's been constantly engaging the Commonwealth Health Professions and Partners Alliance, and we are thankful to all of her support, and we are looking forward to her remarks today as well. I would also like to thank all the panelists who are with us today. They readily accepted our invitation to be a part of the forum. We will welcome them and introduce them individually. And in the interest of time, I would like to collectively welcome all of them. This year's forum was organized by the Commonwealth Pharmacists Association as the lead organization. Victoria Rutter and her team did a marvelous job. On behalf of all the member associations of our organization, I would like to place on record our deep appreciation of the hard work that they put over the past nearly 6 months to make today a reality. So thank you very much to all my colleagues in the Commonwealth Pharmacists Association. It's to your credit, it's to the credit of all your hard work that we've been able to put together this wonderful forum. I would also like to thank the digital team at in the Commonwealth Center for Digital Health for all the groundwork that they've done to enable us to meet digitally. So I'd like to thank our digital team at the Commonwealth Center for Digital Health for the work that they have done behind the scenes. I would be failing in my duty if I don't mention two people. Tony Nelson, the former chair of CHPA, from whom I took over. Tony has been a pillar of CHPA for many years, and his advice and support has always been a tower of strength to me, as well as the organizing committee. Like Tony, Jill Iliffe has also been a stalwart in the Commonwealth Health Professions Alliance and keeping us going. Jill's support and advice is always valuable and insightful. So thank you, Tony and Jill, for all your support. And I'd like to welcome both of them to the forum. Last but not least, today's forum would not have been a reality if not for the participation of all of you, ladies and gentlemen, who are here with us today. In the last count, we had more than 500 registrants to the forum. And I know as the day unfolds, the numbers participating would increase. So I have seen greetings coming from all around the Commonwealth. So I'd like to welcome all of you who have joined from various parts of the Commonwealth and beyond. And please do interact with us through the chat box. So with those words, ladies and gentlemen, may I now move on to invite Right Honourable Baroness Patricia Scotland, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, to address you and to deliver her opening remarks. Over to you, Madam.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Greetings, absolutely everyone. Commonwealth colleagues, counterparts, and friends. It's good to see so many of you connected. And I know that for some of you, it's very early indeed. I noticed on the chat box, some of you said it was 4 a.m. in the morning. So bless you for your stalwart commitment. We've never needed you more. For the second year in succession, this forum is convened virtually, reminding us of the continuing ravages and restrictions of the pandemic, and also that the Commonwealth connection and cooperation continue to be adapted and reconfigured to deliver benefit in response to rapidly changing circumstances. Since the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic by the World Health Organization on the 11th of March 2020, over 162 million people have been infected by the novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, resulting globally in over 3 million deaths. In fact, 90% of all new cases reported over recent weeks have been from within our Commonwealth family. none of our member countries have been spared. The coronavirus pandemic brings home to us all with vivid and painful immediacy the devastation which emerging pathogens can inflict on lives and livelihoods. I can think of almost no one who has been left untouched by this pernicious, one would say, wicked virus. Children, parents, friends, colleagues, and the pain for all is real. It is in this context that we thank the CHPA and the Commonwealth Foundation for convening the 2021 Civil Society Policy Forum with its focus on equitable and appropriate access to quality medicines and vaccines in the Commonwealth. Access to safe, effective, and quality medicines and vaccines for all is one of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet still, 1/3 of the world's population do not have access to essential medicines and vaccines. COVID-19 has exposed with stark clarity the health inequalities and disparities which persist globally. However, through this devastating experience, we have also been reminded that we are one family and one world, and we must work together to overcome this crisis, as our inherent interdependence means that we have shared susceptibility to global threats. No one is safe until everyone is safe. In April 2020, we collectively honored and made commitments to the WHO ACT Accelerator and its COVAX arm under the spirit of One World, One Family. However, as we continue with the distribution of vaccines, we are experiencing a significant inequity issue, resulting in many low-income countries, including small and vulnerable states, being unable to access sufficient vaccination supplies. To date, of 2.6 billion people living in the Commonwealth, 2.4 billion have not been vaccinated. That is 92.2%. Our solidarity and mutual support systems are being tested during this pandemic as never before. In the Commonwealth family, we recognize that multilateral coordination action is the only way to ensure that all countries have equitable access and effective safe vaccines. The focus of our health ministers at CHMM later this week will be on ensuring equitable access to vaccines and building resilience for health systems and emergencies. We expect policy recommendations to be agreed for addressing COVID-19 vaccine access and equity, and ministers from our member countries will also share innovative ideas on ways to increase the use of digital technologies in health and recommendation to develop and enhance health service delivery and efficiencies during and beyond this pandemic. In our distinctive Commonwealth spirit of goodwill, solidarity, and mutual support, we need to consider practical ways in which vaccines can be made available through coordination by advanced economies with low and middle income countries. Rather than eradicating the disease, vaccine nationalism is likely to exacerbate the pandemic. We also need to examine what scope there is to safely increase vaccine production and supply by making provision for manufacturing companies to grant voluntary licenses to other pharmaceutical companies which have capacity available. What may be best for our collective well-being and safety in the medium to long term is to focus on technology transfer within the Commonwealth in order to increase vaccine manufacturing capabilities where there is currently low capacity. In considering these measures, it is imperative that we continue to stand together in solidarity as one Commonwealth family. The current challenges are multi-dimensional and require comprehensive national and global policies, cross-sector collaboration, strong supply chains, and fair and transparent pricing. To facilitate access to vaccinations, strong primary health services are of vital importance, and these provide frameworks for delivery of vaccines so that no one is left behind, and also help to disseminate to vulnerable communities the essential and accurate information they need about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, thereby building patient confidence and health awareness. In these and many other ways, allocating adequate resources to build strong primary healthcare systems assists in attaining our ambitions and goals for universal health coverage. Whilst we continue to contend with COVID-19, we need also to explore how to mitigate the threat of future pandemics and other national, regional, or global health emergencies. The valuable contribution to this could be the creation of a Commonwealth pandemic management toolkit with resources to increase our preparedness to tackle such threats. Other tools, such as the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index we have been developing at the Commonwealth Secretariat, will assist our own member countries and others to access the finance or the debt relief needed to strengthen their ability to respond to health crises in the future and to recover and rebuild. COVID-19 has seized the world's attention and resources, but it's also important for us to maintain focus on our pre-pandemic commitments so that we can sustain gains in key public health priority areas, HIV and AIDS, cervical cancer, tuberculosis, poliomyelitis, neglected tropical diseases and malaria and other mosquito-borne diseases. Taking our eyes off these pre-pandemic commitments could result in severe losses to major health gains achieved prior to the pandemic and towards attainment of the aspirations of our Commonwealth Charter, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. In all of this, and after a year in which we have been truly exceptional levels of dedication to duty and self-giving service, we acknowledge the role played by our healthcare workers. As we mark International Year for Healthcare Workers, I feel confident that I can express on behalf of the entire Commonwealth our unalloyed gratitude and appreciation for the demonstration of unwavering dedication and readiness to serve in the face of this devastating pandemic. As the Commonwealth family, we will continue to advocate for greater investments in our health workforce for shared development dividends, opportunity, and equity. Our people are truly our greatest asset. I wish to deeply thank the Commonwealth Health Professionals Alliance and the Commonwealth Foundation for their continued partnership and support through the cash of the broad Commonwealth health priorities. Let us continue to draw encouragement from one another by working more closely together than ever before, by delivering joint programs and initiatives, by convening joint policy sessions such as this, and let us continue to commit to our collective vision and relentlessly choose to achieve it. By doing so, we shall be able to work faster towards delivering a safer, more sustainable, and more secure common future. The last year has been harder than many of us would ever have liked to imagine. But what has shone out to me is the fact that notwithstanding the challenges and the difficulties, our Commonwealth family has really chosen to stand together. And our Commonwealth services, particularly our medical and health services, have been second to none. And we have all been filled with huge pride and satisfaction that when we say count family, we mean it. So may God bless each and every one of you for everything you have done to date, for everything you will do today, but most importantly, for everything I know that you will do after today to keep the people we love, the 2.6 billion people in our Commonwealth, safe. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your very valuable remarks. We greatly appreciate the sentiments that you expressed, and we as the Commonwealth family of health professions and partners alliance would be very willing to work with you as well as the Commonwealth governments to ensure that we all overcome the challenges of the pandemic together. Thank you very much. I would like to, at this point, acknowledge also the presence of a delegation of our Indian colleagues led by Professor Sundaram Aluraj, our founder president of the CHPA, as well as all other Indian colleagues. At this time when the COVID pandemic is raging in India, our hearts go out to our Indian colleagues, and I would like to say they can rest assured that any time all of us in the Commonwealth would be ever willing to support our colleagues in India. And it's very heartening to see all of them, in spite of the situation that they are facing in India, have found time to join the forum today. So may I take this opportunity to, on behalf of all of us, to welcome our Indian colleagues to the forum today. We are going to now move on to the keynote talk today, which is on challenges to equity and access to medicines and vaccines, a health systems approach. The talk would be delivered by Professor Zahir Baba. Professor Baba is the professor in medicine and healthcare and the director at the Center for Pharmaceutical Policy and Practice, Pharmaceutical Policy Practice Research at the University of Huddersfield in UK. Professor, we are indeed grateful that you accepted our invitation to deliver the keynote talk today. May I invite you to deliver your talk?
Thank you very much, Dr. Vajira, for inviting me to talk about on this important topic today. So I have about 20 minutes, and I'm going to cover the issues which are pertinent on access to medicines as well as for the access to vaccines as well. Next slide, please. So we see growth in global spending because if you'll have to look at the medicine constitute an sort of an important part of health expenditure in developed and developing countries both. In developing countries, the expenditures are around 60 to 90% of the cost in healthcare, whereas in developed countries, it's between 30 to 50%. But we see that the global medicine spending is increasing, and by 2021, we see an increase of about 1.5 trillion, which is about 3% growth. Biologicals, they're going to contribute. They're the sort of major pusher in this, and they contribute about 52% of the top 100 product sales. Next. We see that the United States is at the top of the global spending, and there is a reason behind it because in United States there is no market control on prices of drugs. There is a free market economy, but they spend a lot of money on medicines, followed by other countries, Europeans, and then perhaps low and middle income countries at the bottom, where you can see at the bottom is Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Next slide. There are major challenges with regards to access to medicines. Half of the medicine spending is in the EU and United States, followed by Europe, Japan, and emerging economies. There is a specialty medicine growth, such as in cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disorders. But drug expenditures are actually rising faster than other healthcare costs, for example, physician salaries and things like that. So there are pertinent reasons: newer high-priced medicines, aging population, and the increased demand for specialty treatment. Next. Access to medicines, as you know, that it's a fundamental thing. It's a UN Sustainable Development Goal 3.8 that access to safe, effective, and quality medicine. There is a need to have the essential medicines for all. Next. But about 400 million people lack access to healthcare, including access to medicines, and 300 million of them live in middle-income country. This is a major issue even in the United States. There's about 1,000 per pill hepatitis C treatment, and actually a sort of a major issue in the elections. In Europe, there are serious concerns that yearly price increase will have significant impact on health system budgets. Next, please. The Lancet Commission estimated that between we need for a package of basically essential medicines in all low and middle income countries, we need between $13 to $25 per capita. But in 2010, only less than $13 per capita was spent on pharmaceuticals by low and middle income countries. So they're not spending as much as this is needed. Next, please. We see a major sort of intervention because of medicines in the cardiovascular diseases. They fell by 30% in rich countries because of the intervention related to pharmaceuticals, but it only declined in 9% countries, and this is because the people don't have access to medicines in these countries. Next, please. The factors which could impact on access and equity to medicines could be no government control on drug prices, excessive use of brands, patents, and development of specialty drugs. Next. And the widespread inequity in access, this is not only related to low and middle income countries, but we also see that in high income countries too. So there is a greater discrepancy, which exists in melanoma treatment, for example, cancer treatment globally. And that's why we need to have price negotiations and managed entry agreements. Next, please. We see that there is a price of not the newer medicines, which are actually increasing the inequity to access and problems related to access to medicines. But we also see that with the prices of older drugs as well. And we have seen the growth in the off-patent pharmaceuticals. For example, the generic medicines, which are sort of older medicines, these are priced 100 times more than their estimated cost of production in the countries like United Kingdom and South Africa. So for example, there was an old medicine, which is pyrimethamine, which was sold in United States, and the price was hiked to about 5,000 price increase in a single year. Next, please. We also see that because of the growth in specialty drugs and orphan drugs, we see that in 2015, there was 65% of new active medicines which were approved by European medicine agencies as well as the Health Canada. Next, please. The newer prices of new treatment, just to give you a comparison, that the price of multiple sclerosis treatment was about $11,000 a year in mid-90s, which has gone up to $60,000 a year. And we see this phenomena not only in one case, but in sort of most treatments, including the cancer treatment, which has actually gone over the roof. Next, please. One of the things which is being again and again said by pharmaceutical industry is basically that they have invested a lot on research and development. That's why they would like to have the profits out of it. But actually many orphan drugs which are being approved they were based on smaller trials and they were based on lower development costs. Next, please. And on top of that, US National Institute of Health contributed an average of about $839 million for research for each of the 210 medicines approved in US between 2010 and 2016. And the government also not gave only in tax deductions and tax credit, but also all of the sort of investment. And these contributed to lower the manufacturer cost. So this is one side of the story. And of course, there are investment, but then they were given a lot of tax credit and things to actually prepare these new medicines. Next, please. So these are sort of the problems which I've just quickly, outlined. So what are the solutions? Next. So one of the things which have been debated and discussed is actually to have the fair pricing for medicines, to mechanism to delink the drug development cost from the final pricing. And this is what we call a built-if model for the fair pricing of medicine. Next. But fair pricing of medicine is one thing. What we have seen all around the world, over 150 countries in the world, that actually the countries who control drug prices, they have sort of, lowered the cost of medicine, of the prices of medicine. Whereas in those countries where the prices are not controlled by the government, where we see that the prices are very high. And this is coming from, just not opinion-based, but actually coming from a lot of research data, which is confirming this. And many, of course, in many high-income countries, the tools which are used to control the cost, control the prices, and improve access are called pharmacoeconomic tools. And these are used not only in United Kingdom, but Australia, New Zealand, and all across the board, where the pharmacoeconomics is used to actually promote the access and equity of medicine, as well as to control the prices. Next, please. And we have seen all across the world that actually, as I said, that in the countries where the prices are not controlled, we see that the prices have actually gone high. Whereas in those countries where there is a tight control on medicine prices, we see that actually it promotes access. Next, please. So these are some of the studies which are being done by an organization called Health Action International, together with WHO on a tested methodology, which is called WHO and high methodology. And they have come up with a complex methodology about 20 years ago. And since then, about 60 to 70 countries have adopted and conducted these medicine pricing studies. And these studies have shown the similar results. So for example, we conducted this study together with World Bank in 2016 in Bangladesh, where we can see that the prices, or most of the prices, were reasonable. Next, please. The similar things in Pakistan, where we see that the prices of some innovative brands were on the higher side, but the prices of most of the drugs were actually reasonable. Next, please. This is very contrast to Malaysia, where we conducted a WHO and high methodology pricing studies many years ago, where we see that there was no price control. So the prices were really, really high in private sector. Having said that, half of the population in Malaysia actually goes to public hospital to access medicine. But because of the no price control, the price vary from one pharmacy to another, and actually it has issues with the equity and access to medicine. Next, please. Again, giving the example of a high-income country, which is New Zealand, which has one of the highest prices in the world about 20 years ago, but with having an agency called Pharmac, they try to control the prices through reference pricing, cost utility analysis, by the use of generic medicines policies, and they reduce the cost. So for example, in 2020, the hypothetical cost was $3,000 million. But actually it was not, it was less than that, it was 940 million. So what we are saying is that if Farm Act wouldn't have been constituted, the cost would have been many, many times more. Next, please. So what are the issues, pertinent issues in access and pricing, which are quite pertinent at this stage? These are licensing, price decrease, indiscrimination, reporting of pharmaceutical expenditures, patient-centered comprehensive services, and affordability and uptake of medicine. Because having the availability doesn't mean that the people will be able to take those medicines. Next, please. So the voluntary licensing by some pharmaceutical companies have promoted access, and they have been able to, increase the number of treatments. So Novartis is one good example, and Gilead and Bristol Myers Squibb, where actually we see that the hepatitis C treatment, the access to hepatitis C treatment is increased. Next, please. The confidential pricing is one big issue, which is not only related to medicines, but also to the vaccines. Because of the confidential discounts, it's still a concern because the prices we see, they are not real prices because of the confidential discounts and rebates. So we need more sort of, transparency in this. Next, please. Pharmaceutical expenditures in the public and private sector, they're really reported. Without systematic data reporting, there is a lack of attention towards the access to essential medicine. So this is a major issue which need to be resolved. Next, please. The three-step framework, which has been sort of debated to promote access to medicine, is basically to look at the data, review and collection of data, whether it's pricing data, whether it's transparency or access data, reviewing the data and taking the necessary action. Next, please. And again, the focus of accountability should move away from measuring only availability of medicine. So the scientists now, the policymakers, they're arguing that actually need to have a more sort of focused approach, which is related to effectiveness, quality assured, patient-centered, comprehensive primary care services. And access could be one part of that. Next, please. And this is very clear from one of the study which I'm presenting today here, which is very interesting, that Novartis actually funded a program on cardiovascular diseases, which was about for type 2 diabetes, respiratory illness, and breast cancer for $1 per month. So the availability of these medicine increased, but it did not affect the availability of some of the medicines. But even then, these medicines were available. The result highlight the poor uptake of affordably priced medicine. So this is again another important issue, that you could have availability and access granted, but even then people are not willing to take medicine. So there are some sort of pertinent issues in which collaboration is needed within the layers of healthcare system. Next, please. So this is the conceptual framework which I've sort of come up with, in which we can see that access is not linked to one sort of issue, but access could be multiple factors, pricing being some of the most important factors, but other factors which are coming through are, of course, transparency and accountability, procurement. But most importantly, this needs to be looked at more sort of a holistic approach, more sort of where the people could see it as a patient-centered primary care services. Next, please. So the policy recommendations are, there are similar issues in low and middle income countries and high income countries as far as the access is concerned, but the scale of problem may differ. The traditional pricing and reimbursement policies have proved insufficient to ensure access. Intellectual property rights are a barrier to access, and WHO has given some sort of priority areas, which fair pricing is an important component. Next, please. Transparency is needed for R&D cost and for prices and discount. There is an increased cross-country collaboration which is needed so that people can share information on pricing. There is a need to support generic medicine policies. So see, these are some of the important policy recommendations. Next, please. And now I just want to touch base on vaccines. About 80% of the vaccines are produced by 5 big manufacturers, all big pharma: GSK, Merck, Novartis, Pfizer, and Sanofi. So the market is a bit different for vaccine as if you compare them with medicines. Next, please. The procurement of vaccine can be divided into sort of 5 major segments. And the UNICEF and many other organizations such as WHO, Gavi, they actually play a very important role in providing vaccines. So these are the first 3 groups actually depend on international agencies. The 4th group is in middle income countries where they self-procure medicine, whereas the 5th one is majority high income countries. Next. So in low and middle income countries, most vaccines are heavily subsidized. In high income countries, the price for a vaccine is 30 times higher. Recently introduced vaccines, they are much more expensive due to newer technologies. And affordable vaccines could be achieved through Gavi and UNICEF and many other international agencies. This in a nutshell. Next, please. Again, compared to the medicines, similar to medicines, the published vaccine prices are not real vaccine prices. And there are confidential rebates, non-disclosure agreements with the buyers and with the governments. And there is a tiered pricing for the countries. Next, please. And the example you can see from the COVID-19 vaccine prices, because you can see that there is a range of prices for these. And these are coming from different sources, not coming from a single source. But even then, these prices are not real prices, though they are published prices in the global literature, but these are not real prices. They could be some sort of discounts and rebates and things. Next, please. The situation in COVID-19 vaccine prices is changing, and the COVAX is doing a good job overall with equitable distribution and supporting about 121 partners or countries. So they have given over 54 million doses. One of the interesting development is from the United States Trade Representative, where actually they have said that they have supported for a waiver, for the TRIPS waiver for these vaccines. So what does it mean? That other low and middle income countries would be able to produce those vaccines without breaking any law. So that's what it simply means. And this is first time, I would say this has happened in the history where the USTR has supported, or maybe, a few other times. Next, please. So the conclusion for this is the published prices may not be the real prices. There is a differential pricing involved depending on the country's ability to pay. Countries' current policies on access may have little impact on procurement and pricing, and transparency is needed in pricing data for COVID-19 vaccines so that countries can make informed decisions. So with that, I would like to conclude, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that very insightful talk on, if I may say, the various determinants of access to medicines. I'm sure there are lots of questions from the audience, and I'd like to invite the audience to put your questions in the chat and request Professor to stay on with us to take some of the questions in the panel later on. So with that, let's move on. Before that, I would like to acknowledge the presence of several of our the leaders of the various Commonwealth organizations who are present with us this afternoon. We've got Dr. Osahan Enabulale, who is the president of the Commonwealth Medical Association. We have Dr. Uday Padenka, who is the executive director of the of ComHead, the Commonwealth Organization for Health and Disability. We've also got Raymond Anderson, the former president of the Commonwealth Pharmacist Association, as well as we've got Dean Jones, who's representing the Commonwealth Organization for Social Work. So I'd like to acknowledge their presence and welcome all of them. Now we are moving on to the next part of the forum today, which is on innovative approaches to supporting access to medicines, COVID-19 and beyond. I would like to invite Megan Joshi Van Hayden, who is the Strategic Development Advisor of the Commonwealth Pharmacist Association, to take over from now. Megna, and please, can you take over from here and conduct the next part of the forum, please?
Thank you very much, Vajira, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to be chairing this next session, where we'll present a series of case studies that actually look at the movement of medicines from the global supply chain to local manufacturing through to better procurement and distribution for patients, all with the goal of improving access to safety, quality medicines in a timely manner. And also how the pandemic has affected this whole ecosystem and driven innovations and changes. Presenting the first case study, we have with us Mr. Greg Perry. He's the Assistant Director General of the International Federation of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, IFPMA. And he will talk about the supply chain from a global perspective and the challenges and innovations driven by COVID-19. Joining Greg, we have also Mr. Philip Tagboto, who's chair of the Association of Representatives of Ethical Pharmaceutical Industries, AREPI, who's also kindly stepped in to share his experiences of ethical manufacturing in Ghana. So over to Greg and Philip. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Very briefly, just like to introduce IFPMA. It's the trade association representing innovative pharmaceutical and vaccine companies and manufacturers throughout the world. For this audience, I think it's important to emphasize that we do have, in fact, 10 associations from Commonwealth countries, and we have indeed formed an informal group of the Commonwealth associations within our association, which I'm very happy to be leading together with some of my colleagues from African countries. I am also very aware that this is the first time we've actually presented to this Commonwealth group, and we're very happy to do so, and believe that and I hope others believe that having the private sector, a responsible and sustainable private sector voice within this group is important, because the private sector plays, I think, a fundamental part in economic development and progress throughout the Commonwealth. Today, I wanted to focus then, as was mentioned by our chair today, on the issue around supply chains and the complexities of the supply chains and how that has been exacerbated, but also shown to be resilient and important during this pandemic. So if I could have the first slides, please. If I move on. And again, that's the countries where we have our associations. If we move on. Thank you. Next slide. Okay. I think the first thing to emphasize is that the supply chain is essentially the veins and arteries of the whole of access and availability of medicines and vaccines. And it covers such a wide spectrum from the manufacturing to distribution to procurement. And we have to ensure that the whole supply chain is effectively and resiliently run. If I move to the next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, if we look at the supply chain enablers, which are fundamental for making that system work, we've got issues around data management, we've got issues around quality assurance, we've got capacity building on the ground. That includes, for example, having the appropriate manufacturing sites, training, skills, workforce. And then we have the collaboration and coordination, which is required at the end. For example, that's very important when you're dealing with governments and you're looking at procurement and you're looking at ensuring that there is a proper distribution of medicines and vaccines. Next slide, please. And of course, there are a whole series of challenges that we have to face in dealing with that complex chain that exists for medical products. The first thing I just want to emphasize is global complexity. We'll hear from local manufacturers, but this global complexity is something that we've seen very, very much in the area of COVID-19 from two sources. One, and this mustn't be forgotten, is about continuing the supply of existing treatments during the pandemic. These will be for non-communicable diseases, communicable diseases, big issues around being able to maintain the supply of HIV and TB products, for example, in Africa. So it's fundamental that we're able to have a continual supply route, no nationalism in a sense, complete ability to maintain supply routes and exportation and importation. We've got to ensure integrity in the supply chain. We've got to make sure that there is no influx of counterfeit products, which we know are very high in many Commonwealth countries, again, particular in Africa. We've got to support efforts to prevent theft. There are very strong requirements for regulatory issues. There are resource issues that we've got to ensure, continuous supply, for example, of raw materials, which I'll come back to later. There are issues around the fragmentations of the market, and then the need, obviously, to implement changes, particularly in cases of emergency. If I go into the next slide, please. I think this is something that really needs to be expressed, because a lot of our attention, and understandably, has been on vaccine manufacturing and distribution, which I'll come to. But the importance of maintaining a resilient supply chain system during the pandemic has been absolutely essential in maintaining existing products. Companies have invested heavily in trying to ensure that those have been maintained. And I think we have been able to demonstrate quite substantial resilience in the supply chain when there has been prior investment and strong professional commitment to the supply chain. If we go on to the next slide, please. So here I want to go on to vaccines, which of course I understand is probably very pertinent in everybody's minds at the moment, and quite rightly so. And I think what we have seen here in the supply of vaccines is the complexity, particularly in response to the pandemic. The industry, its various parts, have had to see an increase from zero production of COVID vaccines to some 14 billion in the space of, well, over probably just over a year, 18 months, when we look at the beginning of the pandemic, the start of manufacturing, until the end of 2021. This is, of course, unprecedented. It's never happened in the history of the world. And as we've seen, you can see there that the previous manufacturing was around 3.5 to 5 billion doses a year. So by hiking up the supply and the manufacturing, the system has come under extreme pressure it's responded, the industry's responded, its partners has responded, but it's been able to demonstrate some severe problems that we've had as well. We've had new technologies, of course, being introduced, which is the mRNA technologies, not used for vaccinations before, and that has required its own skill sets and own requirements. But I think I'd just like to here emphasize where we're facing the current problems, and which is a reflection of supply chain issues. The first related at one point to problems around as a result of vaccine nationalism, which had an impact on being able to obtain components and raw materials. And at the moment, even despite opening up, raw materials remain the biggest single problem for vaccine manufacturing at the moment. It's not the number of manufacturers that is the issue at the moment. It's actually the fact that we're all depending on a small source of raw materials. And that's both for the standard vaccines as well as the new mRNA vaccines. So again, an unprecedented challenge. We have challenges, for example, in the issues of other components for the vaccines. We have issues around having enough vials. We have issues around having enough syringes. And these have shown the real need for partnership and working together between the private sector and the public sector to be able to ensure that we have these correct supply chains and supply of products in the issue. Baroness Scotland mentioned at the beginning the importance of voluntary licensing, and I think it's important to emphasize that the industry has already undertaken some 280 voluntary licensing agreements in various different angles related to the vaccine manufacturing, and 215 of those involve various forms of tech transfer. Now, vaccines are extremely complex. They're very difficult to manufacture. They require specialized platforms. As I said, we're dealing with some technologies that have not been used before. And therefore, those companies, those other companies that can produce, need to have an extremely high rate of tech transfer absorption, abilities to manufacture at vast levels, and have proper skills forces. And I think a very good example of where this has been a success despite serious problems in scale-up has, of course, been AstraZeneca Oxford with their large number of licensing agreements, and particularly within India to the Serum Institute. And had those licensing agreements not happened early on, and a lot of planning was up front, the amount of vaccinations that we have and the amount of doses that we have would not have been available. And I think at this point, I think it's important to stress that from the industry point of view, we have been committed to equitable and fair access from the beginning. We are not happy with the current situation of inequity in distribution, and we fully support, for example, measures that would redistribute between Commonwealth countries, for example, between those which have large numbers of stocks and those which do not, as one way of dealing with the immediate problem of the vaccination. If I can go on to the next slide, please, because I realize that there's a, okay, I've covered that really. So if I go on to the next slide, please. Okay, here I want to emphasize one thing of great importance, and this is regulatory alliance. And the regulatory system, the assessment of medicines for quality, safety, and efficacy is a core part of supply chain issues and a core part of access of medicines. We have what is called reliance, where one authority would rely on the data or the advice of another authority in order to rapidly approve medicines. And that is happening, if we go on to the next slide, that is happening in a number of, between a number of Commonwealth countries. For example, in Africa, we have regulatory alliance systems that are operating between African countries and different regions. We now have the African Medicines Agency, which is hopefully soon to be set up, which will help in this. And one question we can put out there is, how could the Commonwealth actually help in regulatory alliance to substantially reduce the timeframes in which products are available to citizens? If I may go on very quickly. Data information and management and sharing between authorities, sharing between the private sector and the public sector are vitally important. If I move on, please. So there are, if I can say, multiple series of challenges that we need to deal with. And I think this is very important when dealing with the issue of access. We've got to deal with security issues, regulatory issues, forecasting, planning, wholesale distribution, supply diversity, risk management. It's highly complex, a large number of the private and public sector involved in this, and only working together can we actually achieve the objectives of access. If I can go on to the last series of slides. So key recommendations that we would see for the Commonwealth is leveraging the convening power of the Commonwealth. Can we ensure we maintain a dialogue with all key stakeholders, including patient groups, including the private sector and regulators? Establish a Commonwealth-led forum specifically discussing supply chain challenges and solutions, which of course relates also fundamentally to pandemic preparedness. And then consider the feasibility of the Commonwealth having a regulatory cooperation and reliance and interaction with various medicines agencies. We have leading medicines agencies out there in the Commonwealth, and they can help assist and provide regulatory alliance to those in other parts. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Philip, who's very operational on the ground in Ghana and can give some more on the ground experience. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you find yourself. And thanks, Greg, for the brilliant presentation. My focus, particularly from Ghana, is to share a best practice example of how we leverage on regulatory engagements to ensure that we minimize impact of COVID on access or supply chain integrity as much as possible. So as a follow-up to the initial phase of COVID, Industry Association in Ghana observed there were potential challenges to ensuring supply availability of medicines across Ghana. So one of the key things that we did as an industry association was to arrange a meeting with the head of the regulatory authority and its leadership in Ghana. And we discussed a couple of things around how we could ensure that there were no impact on renewals of MAs with the health authority, and secondly as well, how we can leverage on existing resources readily available to ensure that we are able to fast track to a great extent new therapies for treatment of COVID and non-COVID related treatments, because we realized that if this was not done well and intentionally executed, potentially patients on diabetic medication, hypertensive medication, and also special medications for cancer treatments may highly be impacted, and patients will suffer the consequences of this access to these medicines. So basically, the outcome of this engagement was to request for three main things from the health authority. One, to ask for conditional approval for medicines that were already registered, for which MAs will either be expiring within the period in question. Two, to request from the regulatory authority as a follow-up to potential lockdown and restrictions in movement, to request for electronic submission of dossiers or requests to the health authority. And lastly, to engage a regulatory authority to potentially allow the use of reliance policy for review of medicines that have been presented for MA approval. As a follow-up to this discussion, which was very, very fruitful, the health authority responded to our request, not just to the industry association, but to all applicants to the health authority, approving all the conditions that we asked for. So on block, all companies had some form of conditional approval for medicines across Ghana. So this was limited to a year and subject to submission of all necessary documentations to ensure that the patient's safety was not impacted in any way. Secondly, as well, as a result of this, they also supported the need to just to a great extent make electronic submissions. And lastly, upon request, reliance policy was implemented for a number of products. And I think by and large, what this eventually helped us achieve is in two main things. One is to ensure that all products, MAs for key products available for key diseases that patients were on was maintained. This meant that products could continuously be shipped into the country without any risk to patient safety as much as possible. Also, secondly, also the use of reliance policy ensured that we could have some fast-track approval of certain critical or urgently needed medicines for either treating COVID or other disease conditions. And we had regulatory timelines for some key products reduced as low as 3 months, which is a big achievement, which other countries do not have that. And above all, I think because this impacted every company, either generic company, manufacturing company, etc., and ensure that there was greater trust in the health authority and also in the trust that whatever medicines were introduced into the market to a great extent were safe, efficacious, and will guarantee the right outcome. This is the best case example I would like to share from Ghana in terms of what the industry association led. And post lockdown restrictions, we continue to engage the health authority in areas where we can further work together on to enhance supply availability and also reduce as much as possible risks to access to medicines as a result of COVID and its related challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. And also thank you, Greg, for this deep dive into the global perspectives and how the learnings from COVID-19 can help drive the further innovations, both for the daily routine supply chain, but also in the emergency conditions, as we've seen. It was also really great to see that patients were recognized as key stakeholders in this and the importance of maintaining open dialogues. So thank you both. Moving on to our next case study, we have presenting Emmanuel Mujuru, who's chairperson of the Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. Emmanuel will be sharing with us the national manufacturer's perspective and also the challenges that were faced during the pandemic. Over to you. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Meghna, and thank you very much for inviting us to share our experiences. And I'm going to talk about how manufacturers in Africa responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and also the lessons that they learned from the experience and also what needs to be done going forward to ensure access and production of safe, effective, and quality medicines. Next slide. Next. I represent an organization called the Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. This is a continental body that represents pharmaceutical manufacturers, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And our vision and mission is to be a vibrant, self-sustaining pharmaceutical manufacturing industry that will contribute to the reduction of the disease burden and promote economic development on the continent and also improve the quality of life. And we facilitate collaboration between regional pharmaceutical manufacturing associations and to address common challenges faced by the industry and enhance economic opportunities towards self-sufficiency. We do that through advocacy and partnership with other stakeholders in promoting the production of quality, affordable medicines on the African continent. Next slide. Our membership at the moment is drawn from the 3 corners of Africa. In the East African side, we draw membership from the East African community, and Southern Africa from SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and also from West Africa, from manufacturers in the West African community. Next slide. Next slide. I think it is important to put into perspective the global, the health burden on the African continent. And this is very important. One is to look the impact that COVID-19 had on the health burden that Africa is facing at the moment. It is important to note that 75% of the global HIV/AIDS pandemic is in Africa, and also 90% of malaria cases and deaths on the African continent. And there's also a growing epidemic of non-communicable diseases. And these were tested to the fullest extent during the COVID-19 because of supply chains, challenges as well as the challenges that arose as a result of the manufacturing capability that was fully tested during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. I want to share with you the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the manufacturing industry in Africa and also on the supply of medicine as well. First of all, it exacerbated the health and socio-economic inequalities on the continent. We saw Africa being pushed to the back in terms of the allocation of various resources and also the allocation of medicines and vaccines and so forth, and also the allocation of raw materials. As manufacturers, we saw ourselves waiting for as long as 6 months, waiting for raw materials, and also being made to pay way in advance. And also countries looked for their requirements and they prioritized their own national requirements, obviously at the expense of demand from elsewhere. And it weakened national health systems. The health systems were stretched, and there were health systems that were, in any case, were quite fragile. And it significantly slowed down economic growth experienced in Sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Sub-Saharan Africa was experiencing growth rates of 4% to as high as 8 or 10%. But this slowed down to negative territory, where most of the countries experience negative growth rate. And also, it puts in place a very tough road to recovery. And this was a wake-up call. And the question that has been asked a number of times, there have been quite a number of wake-up calls. Then how do we make sure that we stay awake so that we are in a position to be able to face similar challenges when they occur? And what systems are we going to put in place to ensure that we are covered? Next slide. What are the lessons that we learned from COVID-19? What it showed us was the fragility of manufacturing supply chains in relation to essential commodities for health. The supply chains were concentrated or centralized in a few regions in the world. And when they were put under lockdown, this created major challenges in the form of supply of medicines, supply of raw materials, and also supply of other essentials that were required for manufacturing. And also it highlighted the importance of local manufacturing and supply chains in the centrality of supplying and ensuring health security. And it also raised the importance of a broad industrial development base, that it is critical for health security in Africa. And as the pandemic unfolded, African manufacturers experienced a collapse of input supply chains, and it increased the imported input prices alongside escalating freight costs and delays. And the lack of local input supplies, especially in active pharmaceutical ingredients, medical grade fabric, plastics, alongside weak local testing and accreditation credibility constrained local manufacturers' output, just as demand escalated. So these were some of the challenges that we experienced in the African manufacturing context. If we can move to the next slide. I want to share you with the experiences in some instances where African manufacturers demonstrated and with the critical credibility and managed to contain some of the problems that faced our supply chains. And in East Africa, there's an institution, a research institution, that got together with regulatory bodies and firms in several industrial sectors to meet local demand for sanitizers when imports were suddenly not available. The research institute used to produce local sanitizers in collaboration with the local manufacturer, but when COVID-19 hit, all inputs were out of stock. Scaling up of production required ethanol from sugar producers, and also they also incorporated, or they brought a local manufacturer, pharmaceutical manufacturer, to get capacity, and also they also partnered with a local plastic firm that was able to create a kit redesigned to replace the unavailable pump system from China. So this was a response which was done at a national level in order to meet the demands that came as a result of requirements for sanitizers. And this is replicated in most countries in Africa, where we have sugar manufacturers ramping up production to produce ethanol that was required for sanitizers. The sanitizers were very critical in terms of containing the spread of COVID-19. And also we've got another example where there is comparable collaboration between a medical research institute and a textile manufacturer that previously produced earbuds that adapted this manufacturing system to local production of test swabs. The researchers at the institute worked with the firm at all stages to ensure that the swabs met the required standards, and they also including finding sources of nylon, testing the effectiveness of flock heads, since brush heads could not be produced, and ensuring sterilization. At the same time, the research institute scaled up its in-house production of viral transport media by repurposing an existing production line of bacteria culture media to produce VTM for transporting swabs to the laboratory. Next slide. And there was an impressive list with which local manufacturers responded to COVID-19 requirements. This was done at speed through scaling up in production and innovation. And this covered a number of areas, including pharmaceuticals, sanitizers, and decontaminants, masks, gloves, overshoes, PPEs, ventilators. We saw ventilators being manufactured in South Africa, in Nigeria, among other countries, even in Egypt, and also PCR as well. We saw individuals, young entrepreneurs, young African graduates coming up with innovative means and at laboratory scale, producing PCR, which was required for testing and ensuring that there's enough testing available. And this was woken up because of the challenges that arose from the COVID-19. And I think what this emphasized is the capacity, the human capacity that is there, which is often overlooked in terms of the entrepreneurship, the innovation that is available in Africa that can and did play a critical role in responding to the COVID-19 challenges. Can we move to next slide? As I said in the initial slides, this was a wake-up call to Africa, and the question that arises, and that has been asked a number of times, there have been a number of wake-up calls, but how do we ensure that this time we stay awake and we are prepared to face similar challenges? And they're not going to go away. I think the issue of COVID is going to be with us for a number of times in the number of years to come, and there's no assurance that there will be no other pandemic to come. But I think the important thing is that we need to be ready and to be prepared to ensure that we build the necessary capacities, the capabilities that is required for us to face these challenges. And there are key requirements that need to be put in place. There's need for broad capabilities. This was demonstrated. Those countries with broad capabilities, that is a strong industrial base, were able to respond much more effectively to the challenges of COVID-19. And there's the importance of linkages and collaborations that came out very prominent. Linkages and collaborations where research institutions, industry, public health institutions, regulators came together, and through those, and were able to respond to the pandemic. Procurement and reassured markets, these are critical. There's need to ensure that they are reassured markets for those who have invested their capital, their intellectual capacity in coming up with new remedies and with solutions, that the markets are there to take their inventions. And also the procurement systems should also respond to that. Centers of excellence, it is important that these have been referred to a number of times, and they played a critical role. We saw the CDC in Africa with the Center for Disease Control, and also a forum for African regulators coming up with regulations and standards for monitoring and ensuring the quality of all the medical devices and products that we put into the market. And the standards and regulations, those were very critical. We saw a number of sanitizers being manufactured, and the importance of there being regulatory standards. And also we saw a lot of PCR tests coming, diagnostic kits coming to Africa, and some of them were substandard and even fake ones at ridiculous prices. But it was important that we had enough with strong regulatory systems to ensure that the public is protected. The issue of policies is very central in terms of building a strong, resilient manufacturing industry, and ensuring that we create the enabling environment that promotes and supports innovations, that supports industrial growth. And industry associations were also very central. They played a critical role through advocacy, representing manufacturing companies, representing various supply chains, associations, wholesalers, distributors, in informing government policy and ensuring that the environment is created to support the strengthening and the growth of the various industrial bases. The next slide. Talking on broad capabilities, we saw that an industrial base with complementary sectors that collaborate was very critical. Like the example I gave of production of sanitizers, where plastic companies, regulators, research institutions got involved and collaborated, not only in ensuring that there's enough production capacity for the sanitizers, but there was also innovation in coming up with the bottles and the containers that were required to package, and also supply chains as well. We saw the use of different distribution systems, transport systems, and this is sometimes overlooked because it is important to appreciate the importance of the transport system that is already in place. And that ensures that products are made available and distributed to all corners of the country where they are needed. And that improves, and that is very critical for access, to improve access. And innovation capabilities, I think it goes without saying, in centers of learning, innovation hubs were created, and that allowed the integration of innovations, the innovation of new technology, the incubation of new technologies, and these then partnered with manufacturing companies to commercialize those innovations and to make those products available to the general population. And also technological capabilities. That was also tested to the full. And those countries with the broad industrial bases were able to adapt the technology that was in place and repurpose it for the production of innovation, production of COVID-19 products, medical products. And as I cited in my earlier slides, the production of ventilators, PCR tests, the production of medicines, and the product development, and also various areas that we saw the importance of technology capabilities, the purposing of current manufacturing facilities, so that they are then directed towards the production of essential products. Next slide. Procurement and reassured markets. I think this is very central. In most cases, the growth of the industry has been constrained by the limitations that come from there not being markets that will consume the products that are being produced. And this comes from the fact that the industry in any locality, especially in Africa, in some countries, there's no market for the products. And this sometimes is influenced by the procurement policies that are in place. And we've seen a lot of successes in countries which have come up with responsive procurement systems. We can give examples in Ethiopia, where the industry incubation parks have been created, made available to manufacturers of medicines, and innovative key financing mechanisms put in place where companies are paid or manufacturers are paid in advance with that helps them in having the necessary working capital that is required to finance the procurement of raw materials and also the production of medicines. And various countries have come up with incentives for industry, and that has also been transformed to regional incentives. That has become very critical for promoting innovation and also production of medicines in Africa. And also the importance of active industry policies, policies that are supportive and that enable the incubation, the growth, and the sustainability of manufacturing industries in Africa. Next slide. Next slide. Centers of excellency. This can be at both the regulatory and also regional and continental level, and also at academic institutions, where universities, we've seen universities specializing in development of herbal medicines, and these partnering with industry to promote and also commercialize their research or their innovations. And also, we've also looked at and seen these innovations being funded, and the funding and the scaling up of these innovations. And we've seen a lot of new technologies and new proposals coming in place for API productions, and moving away from the traditional thinking that API production should be at massive continental and global scale. We've seen new technologies that allow for the production of the APIs at small scale, at highly cost-efficient level, and at prices that can actively compete with APIs that are produced at a global scale and also at high economies of scale. And this is very important, and I think it will help in terms of addressing the low level of production of APIs in Africa at the moment. And we've mentioned about technology, about innovation. One of the major challenges that we saw, and which is affecting production of medicines in Africa at the moment, is the fact that most of the medicines that are being produced are old molecules that are not in line, that are not aligned with current and modern treatment requirements. And there's need for a massive upscale in terms of technological transfer to ensure that African manufacturers are able to produce medicines that are in line with the current requirements, medicines that are effective, that are safer, and medicines that are also affordable. Next slide. The issue of policy that has been very much emphasized and came into prominence during the COVID-19. The importance of policy that that addresses the industrial challenges that Africa is facing at the moment. And one of the issues that came from the various discussions and engagements that we were involved in is that policy has to be in the form of action, not only as intent. In a number of cases, you find that when you engage policymakers, the intent is very high, but the action on the ground is very much limited. And it is important that we learn from other countries, the experiences, the successes that has happened in Asia, in India, in Bangladesh, in China, in Brazil, and then we adapt to the appropriate policies that are responsive and that are appropriate for various environments in Africa. And also the importance of policy literacy across sectors and government departments. You find in most cases, the policy is at the highest level, but at the middle and lower levels, the administrators, the sensitivity and also the responsiveness and the regard at which they hold the policies sometimes act as an impediment to successful policy implementation. And the issue of policy convergence also came into prominence.
My apologies, Emmanuel. We have 1 minute left.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Policy convergence between industrial policy, public health policy is very important. But there's convergence. In most cases, manufacturers are controlled in terms of policy, strategic development, industrial development policy. They're controlled by Ministers of Industry. But the major influence in terms of the direction of the industry is that actually comes from the Minister of Health. And also it's important that there are legal instruments that are put in place and there's administrative functionality. Next slide. And I end up by showing you this is the PMPA package of solutions, and most of the aspects of that package have highlighted in the earlier slides. And political commitment is very critical if we are to build a sustainable pharmaceutical manufacturing industry in Africa. There's need for policy coherence, between industrial policy, public health policy, financial policy, and tax regimes, and various tariffs, removal of tariffs, non-tariff barriers. And it's important to have a sound sector development strategy. And the pillars are HR development, access to affordable products and technology, and access to affordable finance, and time-limited incentives, and regulatory systems, strengthened regulatory systems that protects the industries and also ensures that there's no entrance of substandard fake products, and also the importance of collaboration, and also the importance of data, market access, and all those pillars will lead to the development of a competitive, sustainable, and self-reliance industry. And at the end of the day, what we end up with is quality access, availability, and affordable medicines. And this contributes significantly to public health outcomes. Final slide. Next slide. I would like to thank you. I want to finish my presentation and thank you for listening to me by quoting a very important statement that came from Michel Sidibe, was the UN's executive director at the 7th African Union Commission Conference in Abuja, Nigeria, on 25 to 30 November 2014, when he said, I quote, "The time for Africa to break its dependence on foreign imports is now. The local manufacture of pharmaceuticals in Africa is an opportunity to develop a broader manufacturing and knowledge-based economy." With that, I thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for that very important quote right at the end, and for highlighting the sheer importance of local manufacture and the ability to be agile from medicines to PPE to bottle caps to PCR tests, and how this has all been supported through a spectrum of legislation, knowledge, technology, and innovation. So thank you for that deep dive. We move on to our next speaker, Ms. Naduta Kamira, also a fellow pharmacist and facilitator coordinator of the East African Community Pooled Procurement Initiative. Naduta will be sharing how procurement has helped to access essential medicines and improve the supplies for patients in their region. Over to you, Naduta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meghna. So I'm going to share my experience and expertise as a facilitator and coordinator of the East Africa Community Pooled Procurement Initiative. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So pooled procurement is purchasing that's done by one procurement officer or office on behalf of a group of organizations, facilities, health systems, or countries. And WHO has highlighted the different levels of pooled procurement as informed buying, coordinated informed buying, group contacting, and central contacting. Next slide, please. How the East Africa Pooled Procurement Initiative works is it's a collaborative initiative between 4 East African countries So that's Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. And the main objective is to increase access to quality essential medicines and medical supplies within the East African region. This is done for pharmaceuticals and non-pharmaceuticals. And the attractions from this pool procurement are product growth, savings growth, procurement value growth. The ACPP initiative undertakes supply chain management of both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical products from local and international manufacturers and distributors. And it also facilitates audit and pre-qualification of suppliers, procurement, distribution, and transportation of the products. Next slide, please. The challenges and barriers that we faced during the COVID-19 were quite a number. So first, sourcing of pre-qualified suppliers, both locally and internationally, proved to be a challenge because PPEs was now a new commodity and it was in high demand, and getting credible suppliers who would supply quality PPEs was quite a challenge. Price fluctuations also of the PPEs was quite a challenge because there was high demand of PPEs, and this also led to not getting affordable products in good time. Lack of information sharing or database on prices. So what will happen is with the different drug supply organizations, we each didn't know the prices that are being offered by different suppliers, and this made it harder to negotiate prices. Lengthy delivery times due to the high demand of PPEs, especially with from international suppliers. It led to staggered lead times. So it meant that even if you place orders, the orders will come after 6 months or after a year due to the high demand generally of the PPEs. Unsustainability in PPE supply due to the staggered lead times. Harmonization of specifications of the PPEs. Since PPE ordering was a new activity, especially with the pool procurement, different countries have different regulatory systems and registration requirements of the PPEs. So this also proved to be a challenge. Delays in importation due to country lockdown restrictions. Most of the countries had a very strict lockdown. So importation of the products to the countries and also expectation from the countries by the international suppliers also was quite a challenge. Next slide, please. So for quality and safety of the essential medicines, we were able to ensure this through joint GMP audits and inspection from the supplier, harmonization of pharmaceutical specifications based on the ISO standards, product quality testing, analysis and reporting, which was done in-house, or will request the suppliers to also send validation or further documentation based on their products. Supply and manufacturer pre-qualification policies and procedure, and supplier performance reviews. Next slide, please. Some of the enablers of the pool procurement were stakeholders, such as the different drug supply organizations that are participating in the pool procurement activities, such as the joint GMP audits. Technology, this helped especially because during the COVID-19, no one could travel or do any activities involving, so communication was mostly being done by technology, either through emails or WhatsApp or Skype calls or Zoom, and central contacting. So the fact that the facilitation and coordination was being done centrally was able to promote efficiency and effectiveness, especially with the procurement of the different and various pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical products. Next slide, please. On the recommendations on how the Commonwealth can aid in pool procurement processes, will be to create a platform to enhance information sharing within the different Commonwealth countries. As I said earlier, it was quite difficult to know who was sourcing what from who. And if there was a common pool of information for all of us to share, that would have made the process way easier and way faster and way more efficient. And the data sharing can be done on different prices on quality medical products, pre-qualified suppliers, supplier performance reviews, which I think are very important to know if other people have gone through the same suppliers and they write up about it or have information on them. It's way easier to source from credible suppliers because you're assured of quality products and you're assured of timely delivery of products. And this can create an equitable and sustainable access to quality and affordable medicines and vaccines in East Africa and promote UHC in general. Thank you so much for your attention.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Naduta, for sharing your information and expertise around pool procurement and some really, really clear recommendations to support access to medicines there. Also, thank you to all our speakers. It's the end of our current session around the global and local manufacturing and supply chain perspectives and how we can, all these pieces come together to better facilitate access for patients. Time and time again, we've heard from our speakers the need for accurate and timely data and sharing of data, which sort of underpins many of the other factors that are needed to help improve access. We do have a few minutes and we're able to take some questions from our chat box. So let me start with the first question. This is for Professor Babar. And could I ask Professor Babar, one of the questions that have come through is, would you agree that in the current scenario that Commonwealth health ministers need to act together and procure vaccines for all Commonwealth like the EU is doing for COVID? And Gavi is only going to have access to cover 20% of the population of the countries that they address, my apologies. Should there be more solidarity among Commonwealth countries? What are your thoughts on this?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, no, thank you very much for the question. I think pooled procurement is, of course, useful whether it's in European Union or in any other parts of the world. And I've also said in my presentation as well that we need sort of more transparency and more contribution and more sort of, with other countries as well. Because more information you have, more transparency you have, then of course you're in a position to negotiate. And it could result in lower prices and it could improve access. You could have negotiation strategies, you could negotiate with drug companies, and it can improve access, basically.
Brilliant, thank you so much. That was a really good, succinct response. We have another question, and this is for Greg. Greg, so the COVID-19 has created problems around access and have pushed the public to seek alternative sources of medicines, leading to a potential increase in substandard and falsified meds, particularly around sort of the unregulated online supply through pharmacies. What are your thoughts on this? And do you have any advice that we could take forwards?
Yeah, thank you for that. And in fact, I have another hat. I'm actually vice chair of Fight the Fakes Alliance. We have an event next week. This is horrific. I mean, there are cases of falsified vaccines treatments out there. So obviously the first piece of advice, and please transmit that, is just get your vaccines from the authorized vaccine center where you're supposed to go to. Do not buy anything offline. Do not, accept vaccine from well, basically people you don't know. It's got to be from the public sector vaccine distribution center. That's the first thing. Secondly, please, yes, very happy to discuss with the Commonwealth, civil society, but the Commonwealth as well, and how we're going to enforce things like medicrime in Commonwealth countries. This is a horrific criminal activity that's going on, and as people from Africa here will know, it's very rife in Africa, and the pandemic has worsened this. Can I just comment? I would think if the Commonwealth could help in redistribution of doses from, I can think of a couple of countries, I won't mention names, that have a large number of doses, probably populating the population where Lavas is already populated. If we could look at ways in which we can redistribute to other Commonwealth countries. We're facing the winter now coming up in the Southern Hemisphere. We need to get people vaccinated. So we did not produce these vaccines only for the developed countries. And I just got to get this message out. Someone put it on the chat. Yes, there has been misinformation, misunderstanding, and misinterpretation around vaccines. The two products, the AstraZeneca product and the J&J product, these are great vaccines. Because of that, they've been delayed in Commonwealth countries in Africa. Let's get them out. And these have been devised for lower middle income countries. One shot from J&J, AstraZeneca, a great example of a private-public partnership.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for Greg, and some really good advice there for all of us to take forward. We do have quite a few more questions, but I'm going to put
manufacturers and address those impediments and create a policy environment that ensures the transmission of that technology, especially to African manufacturers. And I think we all need to be together and also have a common agenda in terms of addressing the challenges. These are critical challenges. At the moment, as I mentioned in my presentation, for 75% people with HIV/AIDS, and these are in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and they need access to ARVs. And the capacity, the interest of the world is in COVID-19, but there's also a much bigger threat to health, public health, that is posed by common conditions that, if neglected, can actually have a much serious impact. So I think we need to create a necessary environment that ensures the transmission of that technology and the idea to local production. And that's all I can say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Some differing positions, different views, lots of different perspectives. Thank you to all our speakers for your expertise and input. And thank you from myself to our participants. I pass you back to Professor Vajira.
Thank you very much, Magna, and the panelists. It was such a rich, range of presentations, rich content, and rich discussion. Thank you very much. We move on to the next part of the forum, which is a panel discussion reflecting on equitable access to COVID-19 vaccine programs. We have with us Dr. Anne Gallagher, the Director General of the Commonwealth Foundation. And it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for all your support to our activities, as well as the continuing support of the foundation to the fora every year. It's a pleasure to have you. May I invite you to make your introductory remarks and then conduct the panel. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Professor Vajira. Distinguished participants and panelists, I'm very happy to be with you here today, representing the Commonwealth Foundation, the intergovernmental arm of the Commonwealth that is explicitly mandated to work with civil society. The pandemic, that's the focus of our discussion today, has done a great deal to confirm that civil society involvement in governance is not a luxury. Rather, it's an absolute necessity. Across multiple fronts, civil society organisations are vital partners in the delivery of health services. They also play an essential role in monitoring service delivery, exposing problems and challenges, identifying what is working and what is not working. And it's the voice of civil society that is leading discussion, debate, and policy formation around the big ideas that are going to really matter in the years ahead, from the links between healthcare and climate change to the practical steps needed to move towards truly universal healthcare access. The organisers, I should say, have assembled a formidable panel here today to address one very specific issue, and that is equitable access to vaccines. The horror that is unfolding before our eyes right now across Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and South America affirms the crucial urgency of this issue. The Commonwealth Foundation has made our position absolutely clear. We are calling on the Commonwealth, its member states, and its institutions to take 4 steps. First, to actively support COVAX to the utmost of their ability, including by increasing financial contributions where this is possible. Second, act as a Commonwealth to ensure that intellectual property rights do not become an obstacle to equitable access, including exploring measures such as voluntary pooling and licensing of IP rights and pandemic-sensitive trade arrangements. Third, use all Commonwealth platforms to make the moral and the economic case for equitable access to vaccines. And finally, we are calling on the Commonwealth, its member states, and its institutions to affirm the role of the Commonwealth as a recognised intergovernmental champion of small states by coordinating member state purchase of enough vaccines for all Commonwealth small island states, thereby managing the risk of delays in the COVAX rollout. Now, without any further delay, I want to bring in our panel, all of whom carry with them a depth and breadth of frontline experience that we need so urgently right now. And please, just before we begin with the panel, if you have any comments, questions, or further recommendations from civil society to put forward to Commonwealth Health Ministers, please add them to the chat box. As in the last panel, we're going to try and get a few questions, but we've only got 30 minutes. But I promise we will try to pick them up in the discussion if time allows, but if we don't get to them, I can promise that everything you put in there is going to be read, reflected on, and shared. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Martlee Mokrikta. Dr. Martley is a clinical pharmacist working in the public health system in South Africa. She's also a member of the National Executive Committee, Pharmaceutical Society of South Africa. Now, Marty, if I can, and I know we only have really 5 minutes per speaker, but can I first ask you to tell us about your experience of COVID-19 vaccine rollout program in South Africa? What have you seen? What have you learned? What are the issues that need most urgent attention, please?
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. In South Africa, we experience many challenges with a COVID-19 vaccines rollout program. As a result, we are far behind schedule and behind most countries with vaccination at this stage. Our country vaccination rollout was divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 focuses on the frontline healthcare workers with a target population of 1.25 million. We received 1 million doses of AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine for phase 1 rollout. However, this was held by Department of Health. The reason they indicate was that it wasn't effective against B.1.351 variant that was circulating in South Africa. South Africa then became part of a Zizonke Johnson & Johnson phase 3B clinical trial. With only 455,169 frontline healthcare workers vaccinated by mid-May. In mid-March, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine was approved, and in April, the Johnson & Johnson. Phase 2 is for persons over the age of 60 years, essential workers, and persons over 18 years with comorbidities. Phase 3, the final phase, will target 22.5 million members of a population over the age of 18 years. Our challenges? The cold chain is a considerably challenge in South Africa. Storage between 2 to 8 degrees, also used for vaccines in the routine extended program for immunization, needs to be increased. But the supply of cold chain equipment is a huge constraint due to the worldwide demand. The ultra-cold storage capacity needed for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is limited. Thus, the Pfizer vaccine will be used in our bigger urban areas where follow-up appointments are possible. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine will be used in our rural settings because it's a single-shot vaccine, as well as the cold chain of Johnson & Johnson is more suitable for rural areas. South Africa has an electronic data system where you must register to receive a vaccination later in the year. The challenge is a large part of our country consists of rural areas where people don't have access to the electronic system to register. And for this reason, we will also work on a walk-in system that assists people in registering. 29% of the South African population is hesitant to be vaccinated. The total population in South Africa is 58.56 million people. Only 0.6% of our total population was vaccinated at this stage. We don't have access to vaccines in large numbers to reach herd immunity. The National Department of Health rollout plan is far behind with implementation because of the fact that access to vaccines is few and far between. Still, hopefully from now on, the pieces will fall in place and our big vaccination plan will start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martley. And I am going to come back to you before the end of the panel to ask you about what you think Commonwealth health ministers should be focusing on. But thank you very much for those very interesting points. Can I now turn to Dr. Carleen Radix, who is head of the Human and Social Division at the Organisation East Caribbean States. Commission, which, among many other things, is working on strengthening social protection and pooled procurement of essential medicines and supplies for the region. Dr. Carleen, please tell us about your experience of the COVID-19 vaccines program in the Caribbean, perhaps also highlighting the particular needs and experiences of our small island developing states when it comes to vaccine access. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, great. First, let me say thank you for the opportunity to present in this panel. And just for those who do not know, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States is an international intergovernmental organization which is dedicated to regional integration in the Eastern Caribbean. Our mission is to drive and support sustainable development through regional integration, collective action, and development cooperation. If you look at the Caribbean and you sort of look at the frame of what's around the Caribbean Sea, with North America to the south and North America to the north and South America to the south, we're along that chain, the eastern chain of islands. And we are made up of independent member states as well as overseas territories. And this has affected our experience with vaccinations. Just to give a bit of context, as has been said, we're small island states. There are many tourism-dependent economies. We have a common currency, the Eastern Caribbean dollar. We're a disaster-prone region, both with hurricanes. We're a chain of volcanic islands, and we're affected by earthquakes, tsunamis, eruptions. And so we are a vulnerable group. The OECS has had for a long time a pooled procurement mechanism for pharmaceuticals and supplies. And in our response to COVID-19, we have worked with partners to mobilize resources and to respond not just to health needs, but to education needs, lab needs, a need for nutrition security across the region. Just a little bit about the numbers in terms of our experience across the Caribbean region with vaccines. According to the Caribbean Public Health Agency report, as of May 7th, we've had just over 1.1 million doses in CARPHA member states, which include Caribbean islands of with varying histories of the Spanish, Dutch, French, and English-speaking islands. Within the OECS, we have been able to deliver just about over 130 doses, and we've been able to cover, on average, 27% of the population. But that's a range from about 13% to about 46%. The inequity is greater in the larger Caribbean, where we're seeing rates from as little as 4.2% to as high as 67%. And that's really related to how different countries are able to access vaccines directly with their relationships with European countries and the independent member states who have to look to mechanisms such as the COVAX mechanism and the vaccine donations. So within the region, within the OECS region, and if I include Barbados, we've had about 240,000 vaccines delivered as a result of the COVAX facility, alongside just a bit more than that as a result of donations from the country of India. And it's resulted in the ability to do this much vaccination for us for now. Some of the strengths that we have include our history with vaccinations. The Caribbean has been known to be a region that's been the first to eliminate some vaccine preventable diseases. Our shared and cooperative approach, because we've all been using similar vaccines and rolling out at a similar time, it's helped with vaccine confidence, and we're sort of moving together. The biggest concerns or challenges are around the fact that there's still major inequity, even within our region, related to access. We said from 4.2% of the population to 67% of the population in the Caribbean region. The fact that vaccines are one tool in the toolbox, and we still need to continue to be able to manage morbidity and mortality. There's inequities in that as well. Across the Americas, case fatality rates range from 0.6% to 9.3%. And it's urgent, it's time sensitive. You know, the virus keeps mutating. So what we're doing with vaccines has to happen quickly. And the COVAX facility, for which many of us are dependent, was designed only to cover 20% of the population. So we need to begin to look beyond that. What does it really mean to have full coverage? The last thing I want to say is that our populations are very young. There are lots of people below 18. So even for some of our countries, if we just vaccinate above 18, only 50 to 60% of the population will be vaccinated. So these are some of the concerns that we have at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carleen. And I'll also be coming back to you soon to ask you what message you would like to give to the Commonwealth Health Ministers. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Luigi D'Aquino. Dr. Luigi is a health professional with over 2 decades of experience in international development. He's currently the Chief of Health at UNICEF India, where he also serves as the COVID-19 response coordinator for the UNICEF India office. Now, Dr. Luigi, it's very difficult to be asking this question, but what is the situation from your perspective in India? Perhaps a little bit about how UNICEF has been involved, especially in looking at this issue of ensuring equitable access to vaccines, please.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. Nice to meet you all. Greetings from Delhi. So taking the first part of your question, I assume that most of you will have seen through the news the dramatic images that have come from India. If I have to tell this story, which is very hard to tell, in a few words, I think back in February, we were recording about 10,000 cases per day. And 3 weeks down the line, we were at more than 400,000 cases per day. India, suddenly, the growth was vertical. You could see this curve going up day after day at impressive rates. There are various reasons, I would say, behind that. I know everybody is concerned and looking at the so-called Indian variant or B1617. To date, and it's not proven that that is certainly the only one reason behind this. There have been other variants identified in the country. I don't like very much this associating countries with variants, but maybe it's the easier way, the UK, the Brazilian, the South African. There have been elections, there have been public gatherings, there have been religious events in the country. We also need to think that this is a country which is extremely densely populated. So a more transmissible virus really finds a perfect environment in a slum, or like in Mumbai is probably the most known, or in houses where children, parents, grandparents live all together. This situation, in short, has essentially completely overburdened the health system. It's like building a wall against a wave of, I don't know, a tsunami. That's how many people have called it. So the system has been called unprepared by the scale of how this has been happening. And this is probably the main reason why you will have seen on the news the big crisis of hospital beds, of oxygen, and also of funeral services to some extent, is what I'm told from abroad. It's going on the news. It's been big. And it is big. Today, thankfully, we are seeing since a few days a decrease. We still account for half of the cases across the globe and a third of all the deaths across the globe to date. When it comes to UNICEF, since last year, we have been working, I would say, on a number of issues. If I have to squeeze it in 2 minutes, let me put it this way. Our core business is, of course, women and children. So our first concern since the start of this pandemic has been the so-called indirect impacts of the pandemic on the health and well-being of women and children. So redesigning protocols for maternal services, newborn services, monitoring, retraining staff, mentoring, IPC protocols, all what had to do with maternal and newborn and child health and nutrition has been one big area in which we have worked. If I look at the other area, which is the direct response to the pandemic, we have been involved and are involved, and I will not go into numbers, but in a number of activities from testing, community involvement or engagement, risk communication and community mobilization, which goes from preventive behaviors to then vaccine uptake. And that's been another big area, infection prevention and control and WASH in both communities and healthcare facilities, screening in airports. There's a big range of activities we have been doing together with WHO. The vaccine, the journey of the vaccine starts in late 2020 for us, helping the ministry to roll out what in India we call the largest ever vaccine drive in the history of public health, and that's probably the case. If I give you the numbers of this morning, India's vaccinated 185 million people, which, if you think of it, is probably France, Italy, and UK pulled together. And yet, if you look at the coverage of those who have received the second dose, it's probably about 2% of the eligible target group, which to date is everybody above the age of 18. So very much like South Africa, I was listening to Mark's, we started with healthcare workers, then moved to frontline service provider. Third phase was opening up to 75, 65 plus. And then there was an opening to everybody above the age of 18. There are challenges, of course, on many fronts. Is the cold chain system, at some point it was both hesitancy or over-eagerness, I would say, but now it's primarily addressing hesitancy or misbeliefs. In these days, we have issues with access because many of the cities are in curfew or lockdown, and therefore there is limited mobility. The coverage across urban and rural areas or across gender or age groups is not necessarily where we would like to be, and there are supplies issues as well in terms of availability of vaccines. I think I need to stop. My 5 minutes have come to an end, but I hope I gave you a broad picture of where we are. Back to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luigi. And I can already see some questions coming in. So I'm really hoping that we're going to have a bit of time at the end to be able to answer those. And also, please start thinking about what you would like, your one big ask to the Commonwealth Health Ministers. Now, we're going to move on to Dr. Hu Yuan Kwang. Dr. Kwang is my goodness, she's a lawyer and postdoctoral research associate at the School of Law at SOAS at the University of London. She works as a senior legal and policy advisor for the Access campaign of Médecins Sans Frontières, focusing on access to medicines and intellectual property. So we really have the perfect person here to give us the global insight into these issues of access that are so vital right now. Now, Dr. Yuan, can you please tell us a bit about how Médecins Sans Frontières is involved in supporting equitable access to the vaccines? And perhaps also, you're a specialist in IP. So we know it's still very early days, but how do you see IP affecting access to future COVID-19 vaccine supply? And we'll talk a little bit later, hopefully, about what you'd recommend in that regard. Please.
Thank you very much. It is really my honor to join the panel and share very briefly what we have been doing. So the past more than 1 year of the pandemic has been very challenging for MSF. As an organization, we have been working in many conflict and epidemic situations, but COVID is really something new. It's also a new experience for us in different settings. So since February, since actually early last year, until now, we have been responding to COVID-19 pandemic in more than 70 countries, focusing on two main activities. One is to provide care and treatment for people who are affected, and also to maintain essential healthcare services for other diseases. In many settings, MSF and other humanitarian sectors are the only healthcare care providers for population who are often neglected. So from the medical action perspective, we're really facing a multiple level challenges. The challenge to secure supply and protection for frontline worker is number one. It's not just about vaccine, but also about treatment and protections. So far, after 1 year, our team still struggle from the constant insufficient supply of ventilators and protection equipment, such as in Yemen and in other countries. We're constantly facing this insufficient supply for treatment center we are working in. And there's also challenging to maintain other healthcare services when COVID are taking over some of the resources and when our staff are getting sick because of lacking treatment and care. In Pakistan, we were forced to close some of the programs because of those reasons. And then some of the maternity services in hospital have been suspended because all of our staff fell sick. And there's also challenging for people on the move. And we have a constant challenge to provide treatment and care in refugee camps due to the restriction on movement and other challenges to implement public health measures in refugee camps in South Sudan, Bangladesh, Central American, and in Europe, such as in Greece. And in terms of access challenges reflected from our field experience, we really observed the global access inequity now on vaccine, but also on treatment and diagnostics, mainly due to, if we look at the root cause, the monopoly power from the corporation in terms of lacking the open sharing of technology and IP to maximize the global capacity so that we can have sustainable global supply in the coming few months, and the holding of vaccine supplies based on wealth, not based on need. Many high-income countries secured more doses than they need, and also lacking transparency and accountability for pharmaceutical corporations who have received unprecedented public funding to accelerate research and development, manufacturing, and also secured and de-risk the whole supply and procurement because of public funding. So, and as a result, we see at the global level, the global allocation mechanism represented by COVAX, for instance, have been undermined because of the insufficiency to secure enough supply. And then there's ongoing challenge of securing vaccine doses for frontline workers, people on the move and in conflict zones. And for instance, earlier this year, our project had observed there is over 6 times more likely to have vaccination in Israel than in Palestine due to the inequity of supply and the distribution. So the local challenge and the global challenge are really intertwined and connected from our over 1 year experience working on the front line. So I'll stop here and maybe we can talk about recommendation very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Yuan. There was so much there. I think I'm making these notes about accountability for public funds, the need to be looking at treatment and protection as well as vaccines. There's so much there, and I know there's a lot of interest coming in our chat around the issue of vaccine hesitancy. But can I now go back to each of the speakers in turn to take just a minute and share with the group your one big ask of the Commonwealth, its member states and its institutions. What do you want to tell the Commonwealth health ministers? Dr. Martley, what's the single action that you feel is most urgent, most necessary to make a real difference right now that the Commonwealth ministers need to know about?
In South Africa, we have a public and a private healthcare sector. At this stage, only the public sector can negotiate for vaccines with the rest of the world. So an important aspect will be to give the private sector an equal chance to negotiate for vaccines in the foreseeable future. This will improve access to vaccines in South Africa and accelerate the vaccination program in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martley. I've taken close note of that, and it's going into our summary. Now, Dr. Carleen, what's your one big request to the Commonwealth health ministers?
Well, thank you. My one big request is just reminding everyone that this pandemic has shown us that we can do what we thought was impossible in time frames that we thought improbable. And so what I'm asking is that we begin to ask for more of some of the mechanisms that have been set up at a time when we were thinking less. So beginning to ask for more from the COVAX mechanisms, from redistribution, from protection and management supplies, just beginning to ask for more, because we know we can do more, and so we need to be doing more.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carleen. And I think that that's a wonderful call to arms, isn't it? Because I think that there's many civil society groups, many Commonwealth citizens around the world marveling at what governments can actually do when they put their mind to it, marveling at what money can become available if it's urgent enough. So I think that that's a very inspirational point from you. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Luigi, what's your big ask for the Commonwealth health ministers?
Okay, so I'm in a country where it's really exciting to be part of this vaccine drive. It's something that has gone at big scale, maybe not perfect, but you know, India was starting from 30 years of a solid immunization programs. I also come from a global organization or belong to it, which has committed to provide 2 billion doses of vaccines across the 93 COVAX countries. So my ask is collectively, let us invest on COVAX. There is a mechanism, it's there. Yes, it was targeted for 20%, but if we have a mechanism, let's use it and improve it at its best. And you know, no one has said that we cannot go beyond 20%. So very much in line with the report of the independent panel on pandemic preparedness published on The Lancet. That would be my big ask. If you give me a second slot, I'll take it. Please do not convey the message that done the vaccine game over. This is the most risky move that every society can do. And I've seen it happening across the protection, the preparedness of healthcare facilities, the training of staff, the measures that we are adopting cannot be dropped once the vaccine reaches a certain coverage. Otherwise, we go back to step 1. Sorry if I took the liberty. I didn't know which to pick, so I picked 2. Thank you.
Not at all, Dr. Luigi. I think we're all very grateful for that second point, and I really hope we have time to come back to it quickly. Dr. Yuan, what's your big ask to the Commonwealth Health Ministers?
Thank you. So maybe I didn't finish my other point on the IP, but so I will start. I will conclude with that, because for the moment there's a lot of discussion on inequity, but then the whole pandemic revealed there's really a structural problem facing us in terms of production, supply, and access. For the moment, as we heard, the big industry and some of the donor government who hasn't been convinced still maintain the mentality of a dependent model, meaning that technology are controlled by certain multinational companies, mostly in the north, and then southern country remain as a subsidiary and the recipient. Even some of the so-called technology transfer term is disguised behind a controlled contractor agreement. This needs to be changed in the future if we want to have a true sustainable access for the future, for even in this pandemic in the coming few months, when we, as we know, the whole pandemic is not over, vaccination is not over, that's a huge. So government need to focus on addressing the root cause. I mean, of course, we have been working on supporting the TRIPS waiver proposal process, which is a timely proposal to address this problem and change the mentality and change the practical pathway so we can support more local production for local supply, not just local production for big companies. And in the long term, really work on strengthening local capacity so that we can have a more capacity to produce and supply vaccine close to the people, close to the public health programs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yuan. And just before I summarize, I know that we're taking a couple of minutes extra, but I was given a bit of permission to do that through the organizers. So just 1 minute, if I can ask each of you to just focus a second on vaccine hesitancy and what your big thought is on that, because it's coming up in the chat. And I know that there's very different experience, and we've got this wonderful global perspective, but we've also got these important regional perspectives. Can I start with you, Dr. Martley? Have you got any thoughts on vaccine hesitancy and how this can be addressed really at the Commonwealth level as well?
In South Africa, we don't really have a big problem with vaccine hesitancy at scale. But I think communication between the population and between healthcare workers and the population is the most important thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Carleen.
Yes, it's certainly an issue we have to continue to address. I think we need to listen to concerns, engage, and continue to share relevant information, relevant, transparent, balanced information about what we can expect and what we don't know. And I think with that continued messaging, we can begin to shift, some of the persons who are uncertain to want to be vaccinated. That's what I would say.
Thanks very much, Dr. Carleen. I think this idea of listening, engaging, and sharing information, that sounds very strong. Dr. Luigi.
So very much on the lines. I think in the last 1 year, everybody in the world has become an epidemiologist. So there is so much misinformation out there, and that is very hard for individuals who are not babies, which is our historical target groups, are people of a different age groups, to be convinced. I think A, it can be done. B, it takes time. C, it needs to be a proper mix of clear, simple information, media, social media consistently managed, and the listening and door-to-door community level sharing. And that's where the big role of civil society and local groups, CSOs, comes to play to make it happen. Without that, it's not via Twitter that people will change their beliefs.
No.
Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luigi. I think you've got everyone on side in relation to that. Dr. Yuan, would you have a final word to say on that? I think particularly from the global perspective and the experience of Médecins Sans Frontières on this issue.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a really challenge. So acknowledging that I'm not a medical profession, so I'm just speaking from the observation. So from our perspective, is listen to the science and then increase transparency and working with community, because many of the hesitancy probably from misunderstanding and misinformation, and then this, to really get science close to people and to understand the value, the risk and benefits comparisons is super important. And also there's a lot of a historical factor when certain community are historically excluded from information access, from science education. This also contributed to a lot of gaps in terms of understanding what vaccine can do and cannot do. So this really, I think there's a lot of emerging discussion of investing and strengthening community level of health services. I think that would be one of the essential steps for consideration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huan. And just before closing the panel, I really think it's worthwhile me emphasizing the points that you made, because this is about what we can take to the Commonwealth Health Ministers. So this panel is asking the Commonwealth Health Ministers to give the private sector a chance to negotiate for vaccines, that this is an essential part of ensuring access. It's also reminding them that the pandemic has shown us what's possible, that the impossible is in fact possible, and asking them to ask for more, and us asking them for more at a time when we thought things that we thought were not possible have been shown to be more than possible. So let's ride that wave and not just get dumped by it. We need to invest more in COVAX. 20%, it all sounded wonderful a little while ago. It's not enough. We need our particularly the wealthier countries to get behind COVAX and to really give this facility the strength that it needs to do its job properly. And finally, we need to think about this pandemic will hopefully pass and the next challenge is going to come up. What are the structural problems that it has exposed, and how are we going to deal with those? How are we going to build the capacity of communities, of societies, so that they can be really a player in this and not a dependent in an equation which is just so fundamentally unfair. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank these. I feel that I had such a wonderful stroke of good fortune to be able to moderate a panel of just such energetic and experienced and wise practitioners, really. So thank you so much. Thank you. Like the chat's going a little bit crazy. Please know that we record the chat. We're looking at it all, and we're going to push our Commonwealth Health Ministers to stand up and to do what's needed to take this issue forward. Thank you so much, colleagues, and I'll pass over to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you very much, Dr. Gallagher. That was indeed a very, very interesting and fascinating panel. Thank you to all the panelists, as well as all those who chatting away, as it were, in the chat box and enriching the discussion and the conversation. We'll be, as stated, we'll be capturing all of those, the comments by the panelists, as well as the useful suggestions coming on chat when we collate our reports. So with that, we move on. But before we move on, I'd like to acknowledge the presence in the among the participants of I think the entire team of the Economic, Youth and Sustainable Development Directorate of the Commonwealth Secretariat with us this afternoon. We've got Lynn Robinson, the head of the head of social policy development, as well as Janet Mugambe, who is the new health advisor at the Secretariat, as well as the others, Susan, Emily, and others. I saw you all there among the participants. Thank you for participating, and I hope with your support, the excellent support that you have been giving us, we will be able to take these recommendations coming from this forum forward, and we will look forward to engaging the health ministers in the meeting, health ministers meeting in a few days. So with that, we move on to the next talk. It gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Jim Campbell, who is the Director for Health Workforce at the WHO. He is going to talk to us on working for a future of equitable access to medicines and vaccines, a workforce perspective. Dr. Campbell, thank you very much for taking your time off. I know it's a very, very busy time for the WHO, to being with us and sharing your perspectives with today at the Commonwealth Civil Society Policy Forum. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Professor Vajira, thank you very much and for the opportunity to address the Civil Society Policy Forum today. Best wishes and appreciation to the Commonwealth Health Professions Alliance and the Commonwealth Pharmacists Association, and respect and best wishes also to the Right Honourable Baroness Patricia Scotland, Dr. Anne Gallagher, and to all the panelists and speakers. I've been listening attentively for the period since this morning, since the opening remarks, listening to some of the discussions, and I want to be able to build upon some of the perspectives that we've had from Greg Perry, from Madly in South Africa, and others there, centered around two areas. And the first area, really just to update everyone around the role of the COVAX facility in the ACT Accelerator, and then to give you in particular a bit of a workforce perspective, which builds on your conversation. If we can go to the next slide, please. Obviously, we've been talking, and the Baroness spoke earlier, it's over a year now since the ACT Accelerator was first launched, and people hopefully are going to be very familiar with it. The four major pillars, the diagnostics, the therapeutics, the vaccines, and the overarching horizontal element of the health systems connector, which really brings all of the ambition and intent of the ACT Accelerator into practice at the country level, where really is the emphasis of the work, translating the roles and relationships of the different partners into ensuring that governments are fully supported with all the relevant stakeholders to really drive action. And underpinning the ACT Accelerator, the whole principle of equitable access, irrespective of geography, income, so that we can have a shared approach. It is indeed, as the Baroness was talking, one world, one Commonwealth family, and one element in terms of being together in this. Next slide. We have a really robust partnership as we put together this one world and working together elements of it. And the role of WHO, as anticipated, is very much around the normative guidance, to work with countries to really put them in a position for country readiness and delivery. And then other partners coming on board with key elements of their unique technical advantages and their comparative advantage, including all the work of the multilateral development banks, the international financing institutions, to support country implementation. Next slide. As I mentioned, fair, equitable access is central to the work and the thinking. That we have a responsibility, a moral obligation to ensure that there is the production and the supply of vaccines as they become available is at least distributed where feasible and rapidly to ensure that all people in all countries are having access to this. And you would have seen our Director General of the World Health Organization in January, Dr. Tedros, putting out the vaccine equity challenge in his remarks and deliberations to the ministers of health and all heads, to really say that this is something that we need to do as an underlying principle of the world's response. Next slide. So within the COVAX facility, there is therefore this underlying principle embedded within it around how we ensure the appropriate allocation to countries. And there's been questions as to why are certain countries being prioritized and why others not. But that's actually an interpretation which is a little off track. What is happening is that all 92 countries in the advanced market commitment countries are progressively developing their national deployment and vaccination plans. They're also embedding within that the appropriate preparation activities in terms of being able to receive a vaccine and the regulation and legislation to be able to ensure that we're in a position to apply, deliver and vaccinate the population. And then shipments are following very quickly behind once countries have indicated that they are ready to receive. There is a sort of underlying principle of proportional allocation and a weighted allocation if with supply constraints came through. And I won't go into the detail and complexity, but there's very much as you saw from Dr. Tedros, the priority is to ensure that vulnerable groups, the elderly population, and health and care workers in all countries are given some priority. Dr. Tedros has said, we must respect and protect those who've protected us as one of the first priorities coming forward. Next slide. So what we're seeing, therefore, is a coordinated approach at the global level, which aims to ensure that the financing, the billions of dollars necessary for vaccine supply are made available. And there is excellent progress on that. And we're seeing in the international media, the press, we're seeing greater commitment now in asking for the G7 and the G20 to step up and fund the ACT Accelerator to ensure that the resources are there. We're seeing a pull, an ever increasing pull, which is the benefit of science internationally of more vaccine candidates becoming available. And Greg and others have spoken about the efficacy and the effectiveness of these vaccines and the need to get them out into the communities and the population. We anticipate that supply and production, whilst it's had some teething problems, will come through in the next 12 months and beyond. And the distribution has started around the world. And what does that look like in terms of the doses being shipped to the countries? Next slide. So that's the sort of scale of the ambition and the work at the global level. Let's look now in particular at some of the workforce perspectives. This is a forum today jointly convened by the health professions and the pharmacists alliance and associations. So really to understand your potential contribution and therefore, and civil society, how can they support them? Next slide. We must recognize that the impact of the pandemic on health and care workers is a complex and multi-determinant one. There is a lot of discussion clearly on the number of infections amongst health and care workers. They have often been at the forefront of the response to the pandemic. And in the early periods when personal protective equipment, clinical risk protocols were yet to be developed and yet to be really understood and improved and continuously practiced and repeated, that there was a heightened risk of infection among health and care workers. Thankfully, that heightened risk has come down since the first 6 months, and it is progressively reduced and reduced as our health and care workers are getting much more familiar and competent and practiced in their infection prevention control procedures, especially in the workplace. But the impact of the pandemic goes beyond it. Unfortunately, a number of health workers have contracted the infection and subsequently died. The mental health, the stress, the anxiety of working continuously over the last 15 months against each of the subsequent challenges and different waves of the pandemic has constantly impacted it, as well as delivering and continuing to deliver essential health services. We've seen in 2020 the highest number of reported labor disputes, protests, and strikes ever recorded. Over 84 protests and disputes identified across different jurisdictions. And that's a multiple of almost 8 times the maximum number we've seen before. So clearly an issue about the work environment. We're also seeing, unfortunately, violence and stigma and discrimination against these health and care workers. We turned from applause in the first few months and appreciation into something now which has actually become quite disconcerting and ugly. Next slide, please. Recognizing the critical role that health and care workers have been undertaking throughout the pandemic, at the forefront. This is a leadership vocabulary, at the forefront. They are there leading the response. Member states designated 2021 as the International Year of Healthcare Workers, with a principle to protect, to invest, and to do this together. And the number one objective for this year was to ensure that they are prioritized for the COVID vaccine and that all health and care workers are protected in their practice to come forward. Next slide. One of the challenges that we have to, one of the major challenges that we have to take account for is to really look at what the data and the evidence is telling us. We have 3 columns here to the right-hand side in yellow, orange, and green, and that sort of portrays the workforce as a whole pre-COVID and during the response and going further forward. Pre-pandemic, there were workforce shortages around the world. And so the existing workforce was always under pressure to continuously perform and respond to routine services and any emergency outbreak or any trauma incident as required. That same workforce then, we're now asking to do all the pandemic work and to start to prepare the world's largest ever vaccination campaign. At the same time, this workforce, as we spoke about earlier, with infections, with deaths, with sickness and absence because of stress and anxiety, the mental health challenges, with absence from work due to strikes and protests, is depleted. And we do not have enough to really continue the provision of essential care and manage the pandemic. And that's evident in the graphic to the left here, where in a most recent survey, 66% of countries, over 112 countries responded to WHO's data request, identified a shortage of the health workforce as the most common cause of disruption to all routine and essential health services. So really just to say that our choices in terms of how we look at the workforce challenge associated with the vaccination challenge and the equitable access to medicines and vaccines is going to be critical. Next slide. What we've been looking, therefore, at calculating is what is the additional workforce labor requirement to ensure equitable vaccine and delivery and services to it. And using some of the best models and estimates that we have from all routine immunization, vaccination, flu, seasonal campaigns, how can we estimate the labor impact to reach 20% of the world's population and to roll out the vaccine COVAX facility doses in the 92 advanced market countries. And the model takes on board some of these requirements here. Next slide. When we start to convert the time requirements of a team, and your Health Professions Alliance and your Commonwealth Pharmacists Association are part of those teams in every country. When we look at the requirements of the team, we identify that it's going to require over 1.1 million full-time members to be able to respond to the vaccine delivery challenge. And as we said earlier, there is already a shortage and there's already a challenge in many countries. And those low-income countries, low and middle-income countries, where the vast majority of the world's population reside, are the countries with the greatest shortages of the workforce. They will require support to take on additional labor and how to ensure that additional labor is compensated. This is going to be unlike any other immunization campaign. This is not going to be 1 week or 2 weeks or 1 month or 2 months for a vaccine for influenza. This is going to be for the next year and potentially beyond. And this is where we need to ensure decent work. The vast majority of the workforce around the world are female and are women, and we cannot put them into a position where we expect them to be volunteers for a vaccination service. We have to ensure that they are compensated for their work and their labor accordingly. And that's going to have an additional impact on the cost of somewhere in the magnitude of $3.3 billion around the world. Next slide. If we look then at the smaller grouping of the advanced market countries, the 92 countries, and where we need to ensure the allocation, the equitable allocation of vaccine, we end up then with about 1 billion doses, just 1.1 billion doses, really where we're looking to drive that forward. And we are still going to need additional workers in those countries to be able to ensure the delivery of the vaccine and the delivery of services. Now, obviously, compared to the world's population as against 90 countries, the actual total number of workers comes down and the estimated cost comes down a little bit. But it's still the principle holds out, and that we'll see that coming through. Next slide. We've heard from some of the experiences in the other panelists of what's happening and what's working and where's going forward. And we need to keep doing that. Diane was talking to us earlier about the role of the Commonwealth Foundation to engage civil society, to have public sector, private sector, non-state actors actively working together. It has to be a joint endeavor, learning from the actual experience and taking that through into practice. What are we hearing from around the world in terms of some of the challenges? Next slide. What we're clearly hearing, and I've heard it again this morning in some of the other presentations, there are elements around getting the vaccine to country. There are issues in that supply chain. There are concerns around the capacity of the supply chain. Clearly, there's a lot of work to do in community engagement to address vaccine hesitancy. And health workers in general, pharmacists, community pharmacists, who within their scope of practice are licensed to be able to provide vaccination services. They're also a trusted source of information in the community to address that vaccine hesitancy. We have to do better in terms of, as I was talking about earlier, continuously monitoring and evaluating the work and systematically collecting and documenting what is working, where, in what context, and what is equally not working and what needs to be done. And just to drive this forward continuously. Everybody has a role to play. Next slide. And what we're seeing through this collective effort, and I'm the type of person who is an optimist and a glass half full rather than a glass half empty. What we're seeing is that each week, each month, as we're going along this collective endeavor of the COVAX facility, the ACT Accelerator, this joint work of all relevant stakeholders, is that we are bringing greater volume and number of vaccines to different countries and to their populations, and reducing what was a very stark inequitable access in the first few months. It is still not anywhere near the equitable distribution that we're aiming for, but there is progress on this journey. And if we can continue to cooperate, collaborate, we will have a greater impact. And the next slide, which is the final slide, Vicky, before I hand back to you. Really just to say that as we then look at the vaccine equity for the health and care workers, to protect those who are protecting us, what are we starting to see? The existing reporting mechanisms, not new reporting mechanisms, but existing reporting mechanisms for joint reporting on immunization services, routine immunization coverage, is now effectively starting to produce data on the distribution of the COVID vaccine. And within that, the target to ensure that all health and care workers are vaccinated. And that data is starting to come in. We are seeing the impact of this now from planned vaccination coverage and actual vaccination coverage coming forward. 81 countries have already reported that they're starting to have an impact on their vaccination targets for health and care workers. We see from the reported data, and then we see and have heard today from Martley when she was talking about South Africa, the new data that's coming in daily in terms of health workers vaccinated. But on reported data so far, we're starting to make a dent, 5% already underway. And what we're seeing is some early observations in this data, which will then continuously inform our future work. Ladies and gentlemen, we are making progress. We are going in the right direction, and we should celebrate the fact of how quickly technology and collaboration has put vaccines into our armory, our tools to address the pandemic. There's still a lot more work to be done, and we count on the Commonwealth, your civil society forum, the health professional associations, the pharmacist associations to be partners in continuing this journey and continuing to ensure equitable access for all. Thank you very much. And back to you, Professor Vajira and Vicky.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I think you've set the scene for the common CHPA, the Partners Professions Alliance, set the scene for us on what we should be deliberating on now in terms of really looking at workforce development and so on. And I think perhaps I was just thinking while you were, when you were talking, you have set the scene for our next conference, as it were, in terms of what we should be really advocating now, because it's not just the equitable access, but also the workforce that can actually deliver the care, isn't it? So thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. And we move on because of, in the interest of time, to winding up. And before winding up, I'd also like to, as I've been doing in between talks, acknowledge the presence of two key individuals who've been a part of our Commonwealth family in working on the health issues. Ambassador Josephine Ojambo, the former Secretary General of the Commonwealth, who's here with us this evening, as well as Judith Demont, the Commonwealth, the Rotary's representative to the Commonwealth, who is been doing a lot of work in the eradication of polio and supporting us in our work in CHPA. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon to both of you. So with that, let me move on to the final presentation this afternoon and call upon Victoria Rutter. Victoria, ladies and gentlemen, has been the force behind today's forum. Victoria, it's over to you to may I say, reap the benefits of what you've done over the past 6 or so months with all the all your colleagues in the Pharmacists Association. And so over to you to summarize and take us through the recommendations that you have captured coming through the forum today.
Thank you, Vajira. I realise that we're running over time a little, so I will be as quick as I can, but it's important that we do go through these recommendations and summarise your inputs to our survey, and also from the speakers and experts that we've consulted on this. So thank you for everyone's input so far. I just wanted to highlight to you that the recommendations that we're going to present are draft recommendations, and they've come about through the survey that many of you may have answered, and also in collaboration, as I've said, with our experts and speakers. But obviously after today's forum, and this is part of the reason we held this forum, we will take into account the discussions we've had today, and we'll reform those recommendations to ensure that you know, your views are taken into account before we present them to the health ministers on Thursday next week. So next slide, please. So I'm going to just talk about 3 or 4 themes that have emerged from the survey results, and also our kind of discussions and deliberations. The first theme that's emerged is access to medicines is a barrier to equitable access to patient care in the Commonwealth, and requires a health systems approach to tackle it effectively. And I think you will all agree from discussions today that this is still an issue. From the responses we had to our survey, nearly 60% of respondents, as you can see here oh, sorry, could you just, next slide, please? I'm jumping the gun. Sorry, so of the 149 responses we had to our survey, you'll see in the first graph here that nearly 60% of respondents indicated that access to medicines and vaccines is a significant barrier to effective and equitable patient care. And lack of access to medicines and vaccines is a common challenge, having significant impact across all regions, as you can see in the second figure here. However, access issues are unevenly distributed and with disproportionate impacts in Africa, the Caribbean, Americas and Asia, compared to some of the other country regions here. So as we've heard, access to medicines depends on many factors, and changes to a single aspect are likely to be ineffective if the health system is not considered as a whole. As we've heard today from our eminent speakers, factors influencing access include availability of health information, medicine prices, local production, availability of generics, procurement, intellectual property, health and pharmacy system issues, medicine shortages, regulatory classification, regulation policies, health professions authority, the list goes on. So the role and coordination of multidisciplinary health workforce should not be underestimated either, and ensuring that they're well prepared in terms of access to medicinal products is also essential. Next slide, please. So this leads to our first recommendation around the health systems approach, that health ministers from Commonwealth member states adopt a health systems approach with a focus on overcoming inequities in health information, including misinformation, medicines availability and regulatory barriers, using a multidisciplinary health workforce. Next slide, please. So the second theme that's emerged and has been highlighted today is pricing and affordability are significant barriers to access to essential medicines and vaccines. Next slide, please. And as you can see from these graphs, the results from our survey highlighted that participants held the view that medicines and vaccines are often unaffordable to patients and consumers, and to a lesser extent healthcare institutions. Availability of some essential medicines and vaccines is also clearly an issue, and we know that, you know, medicines pricing is one aspect here. It's a significant barrier, but it's not the only barrier to access to medicines. Next slide, please. If we just quickly break this down into categories of medicines and vaccines, we can clearly see here from this rather busy graph that looking at the dark blue lines, which indicate the extreme barriers that participants have determined, that access to cancer medicines are particularly perceived to be associated with a significant access issue. But clearly there's barriers across all of these different categories. And as we've heard today during the forum, the pharmaceutical pricing and reimbursement policies play a key role as contributors to equitable and affordable access to medicines and vaccines. So there are multiple ways we can, pricing can be regulated and regulations developed. And the most suitable approaches will, of course, need to be considered in a local context. One aspect that the Commonwealth has been investigating is helping to address the issue of price transparency. How much countries pay for medicines is not always clear. Information asymmetry can act to disfavour small and low middle income states, who for some medicines can be 30 times more expensive than international reference prices. So increased transparency can help to improve access, for example, from multi-state collaboration to share pricing information. Next slide, please. So at the request of member states, the Commonwealth Secretariat, for those of you that don't know, have over the last few years brought together a task force to develop a price sharing database. And our second recommendation endorses this work by recommending support and technical assistance for initiatives that foster the sharing of pricing information to improve access for medicines and vaccines. And particularly, we would like to garner support for the Commonwealth Price Sharing Initiative to help increase transparency and facilitate more informed price setting. So databases and platforms to share pricing information should be dynamic, obviously, and reflect the local costs to maintain relevance, and regional procurement and medicines policies decisions can then be more accurately based on this. And that's something that we are taking into account. Next slide, please. So the third theme that's emerged from our work is that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated barriers around access to medicines and vaccines and presented an opportunity for reflection around collaboration and developing local capacity and to make supply chains more resilient and secure. Next slide, please. So, as we know, COVID-19 has magnified issues around access to medicines. As supply chains were disrupted, healthcare systems placed under unprecedented pressures. And we can see here that 78% of our respondents in the survey stated that access has been at least moderately affected by the pandemic, and 1 in 5 stated that access has been extremely negatively affected. Next slide, please. So these issues around access to medicines during the pandemic primarily relate to national shortages, as you can see from this first graph. But this is followed by issues with pricing and affordability. And so the issues impacted over 50% of the respondents from all regions, but again have disproportionately affected Africa, Asia, Caribbean and Americas, as you can see from the second graph here. It's highlighted definitely the need for more resilient supply chains, and the security of supply chains is something that's also been touched on today, and it's worth noting that the lack of access to quality assured medicines through regulated supply routes has been shown to drive patients to seek medicines from sources that may be substandard or falsified or less well regulated. And that's included online pharmacies. We would welcome a recommendation or a commitment from governments around strengthening supply chain security alongside access to support the efforts that we have discussed during this forum. Next slide, please. So this leads to our third recommendation, that health ministers from Commonwealth member states should collaborate with and support local manufacturers in their region to increase security and sustainability in medicines and vaccine supply and reduce inequity in access. So governments should work to support local manufacturing of medicines, which can provide an economic boost, as we've heard from Emmanuel, one of our speakers today, as well as facilitate the autonomy at country level to allow production of essential medicines and an increased low-cost supply of generic medicines that are less subject to fluctuations, which was seen during the pandemic. Next slide, please. We're nearly there. Our fourth recommendation is something we've talked a lot about, particularly during our vaccine panel. It requires very little introduction, really, around vaccine equity. We would recommend that well-resourced Commonwealth states work collaboratively with government counterparts and civil society organisations in less well-resourced countries in their region, sharing expertise and resources to facilitate universal access to COVID-19 vaccines across all Commonwealth states and for all Commonwealth citizens. And it's been very clear that there's an increased call to support COVAX today as well. So we would like to perhaps update our recommendations to reflect this more more strongly. Next slide, please. So recommendation 5 is around the sharing of knowledge and expertise, something that the Commonwealth Network lends itself well to. Initiatives involving multi-state collaboration, such as pooled procurement, are key to overcoming challenges with transparency and offering a more streamlined mechanism for price decision making. So international collaboration is key here for ensuring medicines quality assurance and enabling regulatory approval as a precursor to supply. So regional regulatory harmonisation, such as established in the East African community that we've heard about today, can help share technical capacity between states and streamline processes to reduce the cost of regulatory approval, leading to improved medicines access. And we've also heard about IP laws that can protect and foster research and innovation, yet in some instances their inflexibility could contribute to perhaps barriers to access to medicines and vaccines. And I know there's a whole debate that has gone on today around the TRIPS waiver and kind of sharing of that intellectual property. But our 5th recommendation really is, as a network, the Commonwealth has got this capacity to share, and Commonwealth ministers, we recommend take leadership in supporting the policy changes towards increased knowledge sharing during times of unprecedented global health needs, such as now, including temporary waivers of intellectual property laws and support for the WHO and WHO COVID-19 technology access pool to ensure that knowledge, know-how and intellectual property that are needed to produce and supply products to prevent and treat COVID-19 are shared globally. Next slide, please. Finally, do our policies work? So our final theme, it's not always easy to measure this, and there's a lack of well-designed evaluations to measure the impact of access to medicines initiatives from a societal and health systems perspective, in order to provide robust ongoing data for the effect of, according to the effectiveness of access to medicines. However, it's crucial if we're to make sure that our interventions are working. So our final recommendation is around the monitoring and evaluation. So health ministers from Commonwealth member states should prioritise evaluation of the impact of access to medicines policies to enable them to maximise the efficacy of outcomes, ensure they don't widen disparities. So next slide, please. So just wrapping up, really some thoughts from today. Obviously the 6 recommendations we've presented here are not exhaustive, and the CHPA will review these in the next few days in the light of today's discussions before presenting recommendations to health ministers on Thursday this week. We acknowledge that there's no one easy solution or one size fits all to facilitating better access to medicines and vaccines for Commonwealth citizens, and that ongoing discussions are needed. We recognise the valuable points raised by our speakers today, and some of the areas that we will consider incorporating into our final recommendations to health ministers include the following. Firstly, it's been highlighted that we need to increase the dialogue between all stakeholders to discuss the barriers around how we can overcome access to medicines and vaccines. So today is a really good beginning, and perhaps something we can consider moving on is creating a Commonwealth forum around supply chain challenges and how we can better overcome them, and incorporating all stakeholders, public, private, government, non-government, everybody, having everybody at the table to have the most fruitful discussions. Harmonisation is something that's been touched on as well. So looking at whether the Commonwealth can maybe play a role in helping to collaborate around regulation and create better access and reduce pricing in this way. Thirdly, supply chain security is something which has been highlighted by many of our delegates. So we would like to, as a way to complement the discussions around access to medicines, to look at how we can strengthen those supply chains and tackle some of the substandard and falsified medicines issues that have clearly been an issue with many of our speakers. And then lastly, around workforce, Jim's talk that wrapped up our final session really emphasised, what a fantastic job our health workforce have done during the pandemic, and the need to make sure that we're prioritising those people for vaccination, but also continuing to invest in this really, really important resource. And this builds on previous civil society forums and the discussions we've had there. I'm really pleased that Jim highlighted community pharmacists as a trusted and accessible member of the health workforce, and we really believe that they need to be supported better in terms of delivering vaccines as this pandemic continues and is likely to be with us for some time in some shape or form. And of course, as trusted healthcare professionals, they are very key in helping to support vaccine or tackling vaccine hesitancy, I should say. So it's been a really, really informative day, fruitful discussions. Thank you so much, everyone, for your input. We really appreciate it, and we will be taking your inputs into consideration as we move forward with shaping these recommendations further for our health ministers on Thursday. So just final slide, please. So just a summary of our recommendations so far here on the screen for you. And I'd just like to end by thanking my team, who've done a tremendous job. Megna, who's really supported us putting this together. Chloe and Amy, who've been busy on the chat box getting your questions to the speakers. To the CHPA team, especially to Jill and Tony, who have been incredible. To Vajira for chairing this. The Commonwealth Centre for Digital Health for sorting out the technology and hosting the platform, and of course to the speakers and delegates. Thank you very much for your input and your support today. Vajira, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vicky. I think, so we've come to the end of wonderful forum today. We really touched on what is relevant and appropriate in the current context and dwelt on all aspects of the issues that we are facing around the globe, no matter where we are, whether we are in a developed country or a developing country, whether in the south or the north or west or the east, wherever you are in the world. So I would like to once again echo the sentiments that were expressed by Vicky, thanking all the panelists for their wonderful contribution. I'd like to thank all our partner organizations for coming together to make this forum possible. All the resource people, resource persons and special guests, I must say, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, the Director General of the Commonwealth Foundation, as well as representatives from all other organizations, and our colleagues from the CHPA. You can see there, pictures on the screen now with all the people who worked tirelessly during the past few months to make it possible. Many Zoom meetings at different hours of the day to make it possible for all people from different parts of the world to come together and deliberate and make it all happen. And finally, of course, to all the participants who participated today, starting at wee hours in the morning to late hours in the evening. It's your participation which really enriched this forum. So with that, we will share with you the deliberations. There is the forum was live casted on YouTube, and we will share with you the link to that, so that you can access all the material, as well as we will post the final recommendations that go to the health ministers on Thursday on our website, and we'll continue to engage you as we go on to the future, and hope to see you at another one of our civil society policy forum in the future. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe, and do look forward to joining us in the future. Thank you.